Late one night in 1990, Detective Sergeant Markku Tuominen answers a call at the Pasila Police Department in Helsinki. On the line is a man in his 20s asking him to re-examine a death. But it's not a recent case. It didn't happen last week, or last year, or even within the memory of the detective. It happened 10 years earlier. The woman who died was his mother, and the man he believes killed her is his father. For a decade, the death has existed only as a closed file. Officially, it was an accident. Alcohol was involved. There were no signs of forced entry. Neighbours had heard disturbances, but nothing that resulted in formal action. The investigation ended quickly. The paperwork was archived. The case faded from view. But the caller tells the detective something the police were never told the first time. He doesn't just say he suspects his father. He says he witnessed what happened. According to him, on the night his mother died, his parents were fighting. He remembers his mother trying to get away. He remembers her collapsing. And he remembers his father kicking her in the head. When the call ends, Detective Sergeant Tuominen is left with a decision. He can dismiss the account as a memory shaped by grief, distance, and time. Something too old, too uncertain, too damaged to reopen. Or he can return to a death that was never examined as carefully as it should have been. What he doesn't yet know is that this phone call will not just reopen one case. It will force investigators to revisit a series of deaths scattered across the 1980s. Each one ruled as accidental. Each one explained away. And it will lead them to a man who, for years, lived openly and without scrutiny, drinking, socializing, moving through his life in plain sight. A man who would eventually be linked to 5 deaths. A man who left behind fires, silence, and most unsettlingly, missing teeth. This is the story of the serial killer who would come to be known as the Tooth Killer. In August of 1980, police were called to an apartment in Kontula, a district in eastern Helsinki. The call itself was unremarkable. A woman had died in her home. There were no reports of an active disturbance. No emergency was unfolding by the time police were notified. No one was claiming a crime had taken place. Although neighbours would later recall hearing arguments, nothing at the time suggested an incident that required urgent intervention. As far as authorities knew, they were responding to a death, not a crime scene. Kontula in the early 1980s was a rougher place than it is today. Police were regularly called to the area for drunken fights, domestic disputes, and alcohol-fueled disturbances. Violence was not unusual. Neither were accidental deaths linked to intoxication. When officers arrived at the apartment, they were met by the woman's 37-year-old husband. His name was Ismo Junni. Ismo didn't attempt to explain what had happened. He didn't argue or speculate. In fact, he said very little at all. Instead, he led officers through the apartment and pointed them towards a small walk-in closet. Inside, they found the body of his wife. Her name was Kaija Junni, and she was 36 years old. Kaija was lying on the floor, partially wrapped in a wool carpet. She was half-dressed, and rigor mortis had already set in. There were no clear signs of a struggle in the apartment itself. The kitchen was tidy. Drinking glasses had been left out. An empty wine bottle stood by the sink. At first glance, the scene pointed toward a familiar explanation. Both Kaija and Ismo were known to drink heavily. Their marriage had been unstable for some time. Neighbours were aware of frequent arguments, and police knew the household as one where alcohol and conflict regularly overlapped. From the outset, investigators didn't rule out the possibility that Ismo had caused his wife harm. But suspicion alone was not enough. According to Ismo, the night had followed the same pattern as many others. He said they'd been drinking together, and at some point, Kaija went into the bathroom. There, he said, she slipped, hit her head, and lost consciousness. Ismo claimed he tried to help her, and when she didn't respond, he went to the neighbours and asked them to call an ambulance. But by the time help arrived, Kaija was dead. So an autopsy was ordered, and while investigators waited for the results, the couple's 3 children, all under the age of 15, were questioned. Their responses were minimal. Short answers, silence, Nothing that clearly contradicted their father's account. Whatever they knew, it wasn't coming out in that moment, and without it, there was only Ismo's word to go off. When the medical examiner's findings came back, they complicated the picture, but not enough to overturn it. Kaija had suffered head trauma. There was extensive bleeding inside her brain. She had also inhaled water. And during the examination, one detail stood out immediately. One of her upper front teeth was missing. It hadn't fallen out naturally. The root was long and intact. It was a healthy tooth, recently removed. There were also bruises on her body. Some could be explained by the fall. Others were more difficult to place. Their presence raised questions, but not definitive answers. Nearby, investigators also noted a drain pump, later identified as a toilet plunger. It was recorded among the items in the apartment, but at the time, it was not treated as significant. When questioned about the missing tooth, Ismo offered an explanation. He said he'd tried to resuscitate his wife, and according to him, the tooth came loose while he was forcing her mouth open. The explanation was not convincing, but neither was it impossible. In the end, investigators were forced to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. The crime scene and the injuries could fit an accidental death. Alcohol was involved. Falls happen. People get hurt. And without clear evidence tying Ismo directly to an assault, there was no legal basis to charge him. He was arrested briefly, then released. The investigation was closed. Kaija Junni's death was officially ruled an accident. And for the next 10 years, that decision would remain unchallenged. After Kaija's death, the family changed overnight. The couple's children were removed from the apartment and sent to live with their grandparents. The household they had grown up in was gone, replaced by a new kind of silence. In the years that followed, life continued around them. Ismo received an insurance payout of around 50,000 marks after their mother's death, but they didn't see any of it. Instead, he used it to finance his continued drinking habit. To those around him, he appeared familiar and ordinary. He was sometimes volatile, often drunk, but none of it was seen as unusual. There were, however, some people who felt uneasy in his presence. Some neighbours later said they had heard arguments on the night Kaija died. Others recalled screaming or children crying. There was a sense that there was more to the story than a simple accident. But none of it had been formally documented at the time, and no reports or statements from any of them had been taken. So what remained was a gap. There was a missing tooth, an out-of-place plunger, a death ruled accidental despite visible signs of violence, and unbeknownst to anyone at the time, a child who grew into adulthood carrying a memory of something terrible that had never been shared with anyone. By the late 1980s, Kaija Junni's death was no longer discussed. It had become one more case in a filing cabinet, closed, dated, and forgotten. And then that phone call came in. After the phone call in 1990, the archived case file was pulled from storage. Detective Sergeant Tuominen began working through documents that had not been reviewed in nearly a decade. Black and white photographs, brief witness notes, autopsy reports, and short summaries, clearly written with a conclusion already in mind. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The paperwork was complete. The case had been signed off. But what stood out was not what the file contained. It was what it didn't. Given the eldest son had just claimed to have witnessed his mother's murder, Detective Sergeant Tuominen was surprised to find that his statement, or that of anyone other than Ismo, had never been taken. There was no way to verify or dispute what he'd just been told, because there was no information in the file. But looking at it now, with potential murder in his mind, Ismo's explanation for his wife's missing tooth suddenly felt a lot less solid. Could a healthy tooth really have just fallen out of her mouth like that? None of these lines of inquiry had ever been pursued in the case. So the detective arranged to meet the son and find out more about what he claimed to have witnessed. When they spoke face to face, the son was calm. He didn't speculate. He didn't dramatize. He described events plainly, as he remembered them. He told the detective that on the night his mother died, his parents had been drinking, and an argument broke out. As his father turned violent, his mother tried to get away. At some point, she fell or collapsed, and he saw his father kick her hard in the head. After that, everything went quiet. His younger siblings were asleep, so none of them witnessed what he did. And by morning, life resumed its normal rhythm, as if nothing had happened the night before. The children were sent to school, and only when they returned home later that day were they told that their mother had died. The limited autopsy details Detective Sergeant Tuominen had access to did actually back up the story. If Kaija had been murdered as her son claimed, it would explain the head trauma and bleeding that had been documented. And that tooth. He just couldn't shake that tooth. It just couldn't have been removed by accident. Of course, none of it proved murder. But taken together, alongside an eyewitness account that had never been recorded, it raised a question that had not been seriously examined in 1980. What if Kaija Junni's death had not been an accident? To try and verify some of the son's account, Detective Sergeant Tuominen decided to speak to the neighbours who Ismo had gone to call the emergency services, Isla and Matti Harpanen. He wanted to find out if they'd heard anything that night, or if there'd been anything unusual about him when he'd entered their home. Isla told the detective that she had heard a disturbance that night, bangs and screams, but that when Ismo came to her door he looked calm, neat and unsettlingly ordinary. Not panicked, not shaken, just composed, as if he was delivering any old news, not telling them his wife was dead. She told him that her husband Matti was more than just Ismo's neighbour. He was a drinking buddy, a friend, someone who knew him, inside and out. Their families had overlapped for years. She said Matti spent long stretches at Ismo's place, not an afternoon here and there, but days and even weeks sometimes, because she didn't allow drinking in their own home. And she described the atmosphere it created. Two men drinking for days, the same arguments looping, the same chaos repeating. She even believed Kaija hadn't started out as someone who drank like that she began drinking simply to endure what the house became when her husband and Matti were drinking. Ismo wasn't a stranger to her. He was someone woven into her everyday life. She believed Matti and Kaija got along unusually well, enough that it fed Ismo's insecurity and paranoia. In her telling, jealousy wasn't a passing mood in that marriage. It turned ordinary nights into interrogations, accusations, and sometimes bruises no one asked too many questions about. She had feared for Kaija's safety long before the night Ismo arrived at her door. According to her, after his wife's death, Ismo began to speak frequently about death. He talked about his desire to work in a cemetery morgue, which she found unsettling. And neighbours had noticed how often he visited his wife's grave, behaviour Isla believed was meant to make him appear credible, grieving, and beyond suspicion. She also claimed that he'd spoken openly about the police investigation into Kaija's death, and that after he'd been cleared and released, she'd heard him bragging about how the police would never be able to prove anything. She even recalled an occasion where she'd witnessed Ismo threaten his eldest son while drunk because the boy implied he knew something he shouldn't. Another time, she said, Matti had mentioned a small tin box Ismo carried around, which he believed contained Kaija's missing tooth. She said that she talked about going to the police more than once with her doubts about Ismo, but that her husband had refused. Not because he didn't suspect him as well, but because he didn't believe it would change anything. But when the detective asked to speak to Matti, he discovered that he was already too late. He had been dead for years. In November of 1986, Matti and his dog had died in a fire at his summer cottage in Kivenokka, a coastal allotment garden area in Helsinki, where small wooden cabins stood close together, often used as weekend retreats. At the time, the fire had been ruled as accidental. Apparently, a stove had malfunctioned. There was no evidence of arson, and nothing was formally recorded as suspicious. But Isla felt differently about her husband's death. She told the detective that Matti was a heavy drinker, and his behaviour was erratic and sometimes volatile. And on one evening, she confided in Ismo about her struggles with him. Ismo grabbed her by the shoulders and said to her, "Don't worry, it'll get easier for you soon." At the time, the remark made no sense. But after the fire, it took on a different meaning. After Matti's death, Ismo had told her that he'd been present at the cabin when the fire started, a statement that had never made sense to her, because if it was true, he had not attempted to help his friend. He had not alerted emergency services, and he had not suffered any injuries himself. In a matter of days, Detective Sergeant Tuominen had suddenly stumbled across a second witness implicating Ismo in a second potential murder. And while he couldn't be certain that either claim was true at this point, it was hard not to feel like he was perhaps looking at something even darker and more unsettling than he'd first assumed. Ismo Junni was brought in for questioning. At first, he repeated the same explanation he had given 10 years earlier. They'd been drinking. His wife had fallen. He'd panicked. He'd tried to help her. It had all just been a terrible accident. Nothing more. But as investigators pressed him on the details, his explanation began to fracture. They confronted him with the injuries that didn't fit a simple fall, with the water in Kaija's lungs, with the head trauma, with the missing tooth, and with his son's very detailed and believable account. And with every question, Ismo's story began to change. He was scrambling, desperately trying to explain away everything they put to him. And when one explanation failed, he threw another one out. He was falling apart under pressure. At first he suggested that his wife had tried to drown herself, to try and explain why there was water in her lungs. But then he said that he had actually held her head under the water in the bathtub, but not to harm her, to calm her down. He claimed that might have been how she got some of her bruises too. When they confronted him with his son's account, he finally admitted that the argument had become physical. He admitted that he'd hit her, he'd kicked her as his son had said, that he'd thrown her against the furniture, and that she'd suffered her head injuries during the assault, not from a fall as he'd originally told investigators. So Ismo's account had changed from an accidental fall to a violent attack that included holding her head underwater. When pushed, he claimed that his wife became unconscious when her head was under the water, but that she was still alive when he dragged her out of the bathroom. And as the questioning continued, his story only got darker. Perhaps he realised his admissions had crossed a line he couldn't walk back from, so there was no point pretending anymore. Perhaps guilt finally forced the truth out of him. Or perhaps he was just relieved to finally tell someone the truth. Whatever the reasoning, nobody ever expected what he revealed next. Because then, Ismo told them that he'd moved his wife's body into the walk-in closet, and there, he attempted to engage in sexual acts with her while she was unconscious. When that failed, he told them that he had sexually assaulted her with a toilet plunger, later identified among the items found at the scene. And finally, he told them that after he'd finished, he removed her tooth. He claimed he did it to check whether she was just pretending to be dead. He never once used the word murder in his disjointed confession, but he didn't need to. There was no other possible way to see the events he had just described to them. The confession fundamentally changed the understanding of Kaija's death, but it also raised a new and unsettling question. If Ismo was capable of such extreme and disturbing violence, and of keeping the truth about it hidden for so long, what else might have been overlooked? When police questioned Ismo about Matti Harpinen's death, his responses followed a now familiar pattern. At first, he placed himself nowhere near Kivinoka that night. When investigators challenged him with the details they had uncovered, he shifted his account and admitted he had seen Matti earlier in the day. Eventually, he acknowledged being at the cabin when the fire started. And then, finally, he confessed. According to Ismo, the two men had been drinking together, as they often did, when an argument had broken out, over something he described as trivial. During the confrontation, he struck Matti with a glass vase. As a result, one of Matti's teeth had broken through his upper lip. And for reasons no one will probably ever truly understand but him, Ismo pulled it out. He later admitted that he placed the tooth in the same small container where he had kept his wife's tooth. After the assault, Matti was left unconscious, but not dead. Ismo told investigators that during the struggle, a candle had been knocked over inside the cabin. He claimed it was an accident, but that he did nothing to stop the fire that caught. Instead, he not only allowed the flames to spread, he helped them. He added fuel to ensure the fire would take hold, pouring flammable liquid around the room before leaving. As he exited the cabin, he picked up a burning container of some sort. Outside, he hurled it against the wall of a neighbouring cottage, igniting a second fire. Only then did he move away, taking a seat on a nearby stone wall to watch as the fires burned, leaving Matti and his dog trapped inside the cabin. In light of Ismo's new confession, detectives attempted to determine whether what he was saying could be independently supported by the evidence. So they went back to the original files around the fire. As they re-examined the case, details that had once seemed incidental began to take on new weight. One of them involved the damage to a neighbouring cabin. The wall had been badly scorched during the fire. At the time, investigators had concluded that the heat from Matty's burning cottage alone was responsible. In light of Ismo's account, that explanation no longer held up quite as cleanly. During questioning, Ismo didn't speak in generalities. He described the cabin's interior with verifiable details. Curtain designs, the type of vase that he'd shattered. He even sketched its layout from memory. Investigators compared his descriptions with photographs taken at the scene years earlier. Everything he said matched perfectly, in a way he could not have possibly known had he not been inside the cabin. The autopsy report told a similar story. Matty's blood alcohol level was consistent with heavy drinking that night. His lungs also showed evidence of smoke inhalation, meaning he was alive when the fire began, just as Ismo described. Taken individually, none of these details would have been enough. But together, they left little room for doubt. What had once been recorded as an accident could no longer be explained that way. The case was formally reopened as a homicide, and for the first time, investigators were forced to confront the possibility that this was not an isolated act, but part of a pattern that had gone unnoticed for years. Once the fire at Matti Harppanen's cabin was reclassified as murder, investigators turned their attention to Kivinnokka itself. The area had always stood out. Kivinnokka is a stretch of allotment gardens along the Helsinki shoreline. Think narrow paths, small wooden cottages, limited electricity and running water, that sort of place. Throughout the summer months, the area was always busy. People gathered there to drink, to socialise, and to spend time away from the city. And throughout the 1980s, it developed a reputation. Not a good one. Cabins in Kivinnokka burned down with unusual frequency compared to other allotment areas in Helsinki. Sheds caught fire, outhouses burned, garbage bins were set alight. Most of the time, no one was hurt, and the incidents were written off as carelessness, faulty heaters, or drunken mistakes. It was also not an unfamiliar place to Ismo. His parents owned a cottage in Kivinnokka, one he had long assumed would eventually be his, but when it wasn't passed on to him, he harboured deep resentment. With all of that in mind then, there were 3 fires that occurred there that stood out to the detectives. In July of 1986, just months before Matty's death, 2 men had died in a cabin fire in the same area. Their names were Seppo Mentiniemi and Juha Vere. At the time, the case received little attention. Once again, the official explanation was a stove accident. It was dismissed as a case of 2 men drinking, falling asleep, and never waking up. But when investigators revisited the file years later, the similarities to Matty's case were impossible to ignore. When Ismo was asked about the fire, this time he didn't even try and deny his involvement. He told the investigators that he'd met the 2 men earlier that day while they were out fishing. He said they'd shared drinks, then moved to the cabin to continue drinking into the evening. At some point, he deliberately provoked an argument with them. According to his account, he did it just to see how they would react. When the argument escalated, he was thrown out of the cabin. But he didn't really leave. Instead, he pretended to walk away and found somewhere nearby to hide, where he waited until the 2 men passed out. Then, he slipped back inside the cabin and dropped a candle between them. As the fire began to spread, he poured lamp oil around the cabin to ensure it would take hold. He told the investigators that although the 2 men did wake up, they never made it out. Just like in Matty's case, he remained close by to watch the fire. When investigators compared his account with the original crime scene photographs, once again his details perfectly aligned. A bottle of lamp oil was visible near the ruins, and the fire damage suggested the use of an accelerant. Autopsy reports showed the men had inhaled smoke, meaning they had been alive when the fire began. As with Matty's cabin, Ismo's recollection went beyond what someone without direct knowledge of the scene could reasonably have provided. He accurately described the interior of the cabin. He remembered the men's physiques. He explained how he had assessed which of them might pose a greater threat during the confrontation. And once again, what had once been dismissed as a tragic accident was now understood as a deliberate act. But it didn't stop there. In November of 1988, another man died in a fire in Kivinnokka. His name was Pauli Saarinen, and he lived alone in his cabin all year round. He was known in the area as someone who kept to himself and was often seen cycling around the paths. When police asked Ismo about Pauli, he answered without hesitation. "Yes," he said, "I did that one too." According to his confession, he met Pauli in a liquor store. He deliberately stepped on his foot to start a conversation. The two men began drinking together and eventually went back to Paulie's cabin. As in the other cases, an argument followed. Ismo was thrown out, and he waited. Then he returned with the same intent as before. He poured lamp oil inside the cabin and on the wooden steps outside. As he lit the fire, he later told police he thought to himself that he was washing the devil's stairs, though I'm not really sure what he meant by that. Once again, the fire was ruled accidental and blamed on a faulty heater. No suspicion of arson was formally recorded. One of the strangest aspects of the growing case was the missing teeth. Ismo admitted that he had kept both his wife's and Matty's teeth after their deaths, carrying them around with him in a small container. The other three identified victims had never been specifically checked for missing teeth, and by this point, over a decade later, it was impossible to verify if he had also taken teeth from them. But regardless, when the detail was revealed to the press, they quickly dubbed Ismo the Tooth Killer, which, in all honesty, is a pretty poor nickname as far as serial killer names go. But Ismo himself allegedly hated the name, so for that reason alone, I'm more than happy to use it. Ismo never offered any real explanation for why he'd taken the teeth, beyond his claim that he was testing if his wife was still alive. But with what the detectives now knew, it was hard not to see them as trophies, as something taken from the crime scenes, from the victims, for Ismo to savor, to remember, to relive what he'd done. Investigators never found any additional teeth, but during a search of Ismo's apartment in 1991, they did find something else, a piece of denture. It didn't belong to Ismo, it didn't belong to his new wife, it didn't belong to Kaija, and it didn't belong to any of the four men who had died in the cabin fires. The denture was logged, photographed, and retained as evidence, but its owner was never identified. When investigators questioned Ismo about it, he refused to explain where it had come from. By that point, 5 victims had already been confirmed, and while the denture was never officially linked to an additional death, it was hard not to view it as another potential trophy from another potential victim. Were there other victims of Ismo out there that investigators simply hadn't connected to him? After all, every death linked to him had only come to light because something, or someone, had finally forced investigators to look again. None of them had been linked to him at the time. None of them had even been investigated as homicides. And he had only confessed to them when he was questioned directly about them. None of them had been offered up by him without reason. By the time the case reached the courts, the scope of what investigators had uncovered was clear. Ismo stood accused of killing 5 people over the course of 8 years, 1 death in an apartment in Kontula and 4 deaths in fires in Kivinoka. He had confessed to all of it. But as the proceedings moved forward, his position began to change. During questioning in court, Ismo recanted parts of his earlier statements. He claimed that he had exaggerated. He suggested that some of what he had said was shaped by what investigators wanted to hear. In the case of Paulie Saarinen, he denied being present at all, insisting that he had been receiving treatment for alcoholism at the time of the fire. The court paused proceedings to verify the claim. Investigators contacted the treatment facility where Ismo said he had been staying, and to their surprise, records actually confirmed that he had been admitted there at the time. However, there was no documentation placing him there on the specific night of the fire. Patients were not kept under continuous supervision at the facility, and staff could not say for sure whether he had left the facility that evening. Ismo himself later acknowledged that leaving unnoticed would have been easy. More importantly, his own statements continued to contain details that could not be dismissed. He described the interiors of cabins he should not have known. He referred to objects later visible in crime scene photographs. In Paulie Saarinen's specific case, he spoke about attempting to steal a bicycle chained outside the cabin, a detail investigators subsequently confirmed through evidence images. Taken together, these details outweighed his retractions. There was no reasonable doubt remaining regarding his involvement. In February of 1992, the court delivered its verdict. Ismo Junni was found guilty of the murders of Seppo Mentiniemi, Juha Veere, Matti Haapanen, and Paulie Saarinen. He was also convicted of arson and destruction of property related to the cabin fires. In the case of his wife, Kaija Junni, the court somewhat shockingly initially ruled it as manslaughter. But on appeal, that conviction was amended to aggravated assault resulting in death and negligent homicide. A psychiatric evaluation concluded that he was fully aware of his actions and that he was not suffering from psychosis. It stated that he completely understood the nature and consequences of what he'd done, which ruled out the possibility of him being committed to a psychiatric facility. Instead, Ismo was sentenced to life imprisonment for the cabin fire murders, along with a fixed-term sentence of 9 years for the death of his wife and numerous other sentences related to arson and fraud. Just to point out from what I understand, in Finland, a life sentence doesn't come with a specific end date. It's an open-ended punishment, which gets reviewed after around a decade, and often ends in release once the state judges that the offender is no longer a threat. But for Ismo, that review would never come. On the 3rd of November, 1995, after serving only 3 years of his sentence, he died following complications from heart surgery. He was 52 years old. When the case finally closed, attention returned to the man who had reopened it in the first place. Without her son's phone call, Kaija Junni's death would have remained officially recorded as an accident. The fires in Kivinoka would likely have continued to sit in separate files. Tragic, unexplained, and unconnected. 5 deaths would have remained 5 unrelated stories. Instead, they became one. The son had lived with what he'd seen for 10 years before speaking. During that time, his father continued drinking, socializing, and moving through his life unchallenged. Nothing changed until the silence did. But even after the trial, questions remained. Investigators were never able to identify the owner of the denture found in Ismo's apartment. No additional victims were confirmed. The denture was later placed in the Crime Museum at the National Bureau of Investigation's headquarters in the city of Vantaa, which is a non-public collection of artifacts from major Finnish cases, maintained for police training and educational use. Ultimately, what the investigation revealed was not just a series of crimes, but a series of assumptions. Each death had been plausible in isolation. Alcohol had been present. Fires had explanations. Violence had been absorbed into the background noise of places where it was already expected. There was no single moment where the system failed. Instead, it worked exactly as designed, closing files that appeared resolved and moving on. Ismo Junni did not hide in the shadows. He did not disappear. He remained visible, familiar, and ordinary. The danger he posed was not overlooked because it was invisible, but because it blended in. The pattern only emerged when someone forced investigators to look backward, not at one death, but at all of them together. And once they did, the connections were impossible to ignore. Most serial killers are discovered because they escalate, because they lose control, because they're caught in the act or make a mistake. But Ismo was discovered because someone who had been silent as a child chose to speak years later. And with that single decision, a decade of hidden violence was finally brought into the light. And with that, our deep dive into Finland's tooth killer comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and offer up all your worldly possessions to the ever-hungry algorithm gods. If you're listening over on Spotify, remember to follow my page and do whatever else the gods over there demand of you to help me out. If you like what I do and want to support me further, there's a membership option on YouTube and a Patreon linked down in the description as well. You don't get an awful lot for joining either of them right now, beyond my unconditional thanks. But you do get to see your name in the credits, alongside all the wonderful people popping up on screen in a few seconds. This is a pretty obscure case, and one that doesn't have much coverage, so I've tried my best to piece it together and to tell it accurately, but I want to give the same caveat that I often do as a result, that it's more than likely I've got some of the smaller details wrong. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. June 4th, 1989. Just before dawn, it's quiet in central Calcutta. Known as Kolkata nowadays, Calcutta is the capital city of the Indian state of West Bengal and the largest city in the region. BBD Bagh is the city's administrative and financial heart, and the district around it is usually crowded with office workers and street vendors. In the daytime, the roads are swarming with people and traffic. But at this hour, the streets are dark and practically empty. But that doesn't mean that nobody's there. For thousands of people in Calcutta, these streets are their homes. Some are migrant labourers, others are beggars or drifters. Many are what newspapers at the time call hawkers, people who make a very small living selling items on the streets like clothes or cigarettes. These people have nothing but cardboard boxes or thin sheets of plastic to protect them from the elements as they sleep. They operate on the margins of society. Most people ignore them or don't even notice them in the first place. Among them is Alaya Bibi, a woman in her mid-30s. She sleeps beside her husband, Mohan Sao, who sells knickknacks for a living, which she sometimes helps out with. The two of them had come to Calcutta from the city of Darbhanga in the state of Bihar a few years earlier in search of better work and a better life. But like so many others, they never found it. Instead, they spent their days and nights on the streets, surviving hand to mouth. Alaya had gone to sleep at around 11 o'clock, but sometime before dawn, someone silently approached her in the darkness, and without warning, without a struggle, they delivered a single blow and killed her. It took literally 1 second, made one dull sound, and everyone sleeping nearby, including her husband, slept right through it. Hours later, as the first light spreads across the city, a call comes into the nearby Hare Street police station. A body has been discovered near the southwestern corner of BBD Bagh, just a short distance from Lal Bazaar, the headquarters of the entire Calcutta Police Department. When officers arrive at the scene, they find her lying on the pavement with the right side of her skull completely crushed. Beside her body lies a heavy stone, stained a blackish red with blood. Investigators estimate it weighs just over 9 kilos. The blow was so severe and the stone so heavy that no forensics are needed to confirm what had happened. The stone had clearly been brought down on her head from extremely close range. There are no other injuries on her body. There are no obvious signs of a struggle. There is no indication that she had been sexually assaulted. Her autopsy places her time of death between 4 and 4:30 in the morning, and also reveals that it had been immediate upon impact. But there's another detail the autopsy uncovers that makes the case even more tragic. Alaya was 3 months pregnant when she was killed. The homicide branch detectives struggled to understand why anyone would want to kill Alaya, or what they could possibly hope to gain from doing it. Robbery makes no sense. Alaya and Mohan owned almost nothing. There was simply nothing to be stolen from either of them. They briefly consider the idea that Mohan might be responsible for his wife's death. They try to find out if there was another man, or some sort of domestic tension or dispute. But according to everyone who knows the couple, there wasn't even the slightest hint of discord between Mohan and Alaya. She had no known conflicts within the community, no known enemies. The attack just seems completely random. A poor woman sleeping on a pavement had been killed with a stone, apparently for no reason at all. Without any witnesses or suspects, the investigation quickly stalls. The case remains open, but there is very little for the detectives to actually work with. And for a few weeks it seems possible that the murder had simply been a random, disturbing act of violence. But then, on the night of July 19th, that idea completely collapses. Because it isn't just another body that's discovered, it's two, in two different locations. And just like Alaya, both victims are street dwellers with nothing to steal. Both are killed in the early hours of the morning, and both are killed with blows to the head from large stones left at the scene. Within hours, detectives at Lal Bazaar begin to realise that something far more disturbing may be unfolding in the city. Someone is targeting people sleeping on the streets. They have themselves a serial killer. The Calcutta police had investigated multiple murders before, but this case is something different for them. They have never encountered a killer who appears to choose his victims so randomly, and leaves almost no evidence behind. The murders trigger alarm inside Lal Bazaar as they try and work out how they can possibly catch the killer with so little to go off, and how they can prevent further attacks, because there are thousands of people sleeping on the city's streets every single night, and all of them are now at risk. And as more and more victims are discovered over the following weeks and months, a name will begin to spread through Calcutta's newspapers, its markets, its streets, and even through Lal Bazaar itself. The Stoneman. But as investigators struggle to understand who might be responsible, another unsettling possibility begins to surface. Because just a few years earlier, in another Indian city hundreds of miles away, a series of murders had taken place under eerily similar circumstances. The victims had all been homeless people sleeping on the streets. Their skulls had all been crushed with heavy stones. And just like the crimes now unfolding in Calcutta, their killer had never been identified. This is the story of the Stoneman. Several years before the killings in Calcutta, another Indian city had faced a similar and equally baffling series of murders. In the 1980s, Mumbai, which was called Bombay back then, was already one of the largest and most densely populated cities in the world. Millions of people lived there, drawn by the promise of work and opportunity. But for many who arrived there from poorer regions, that promise quickly evaporated. The city's population was exploding, and affordable housing and jobs were scarce. So just like in Calcutta, Bombay had a huge population of pavement dwellers. Entire families lived, worked, and slept on the streets. In many parts of the city, it was normal to see rows of people lying side by side along the pavements after midnight. But even when people slept in small groups like that, they essentially had little to no protection from crime or violence. It was a way of life that was extremely vulnerable. And then in 1985, something disturbing began to happen on those pavements. On the morning of June 15th at around 7 a.m, a crowd began gathering near Gandhi Market at King's Circle as more and more people on their way to work stopped to find out what everyone was looking at. A pavement dweller had been brutally murdered. His skull had been crushed with a heavy stone so severely that his face was completely disfigured, making it impossible to identify him. Nearby, a large blood-stained stone lay on the ground. According to witnesses, a woman sleeping nearby had woken up shortly before dawn and discovered the grisly scene, screaming out as other pavement dwellers rushed over. At first, the case attracted little attention. Violence against the homeless was not uncommon in large cities, and the victim had no identification or family who came forward to claim his body. Police initially assumed it may have been a robbery or dispute that had turned violent. The case remained unsolved, and life in Bombay continued as usual. But then it happened again, and then again, and again. The first few cases occurred in the central suburbs of the city, particularly around areas like Sion and King's Circle. The victims were all pavement dwellers who had few personal connections to investigate and had nothing of value to be stolen. In most cases, the victims had been sleeping alone or slightly apart from larger groups. Each of them had had their skulls crushed by a large stone or a slab of concrete that was left beside their body at the scene. The stones themselves were often extremely heavy. Some weighed more than 30 kilograms, meaning whoever was doing this had to be not only strong enough to lift them, but to bring them down with lethal force. Post-mortem examinations suggested the killer was striking during the late hours of the night, typically sometime between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. For the first few murders, police treated each case as an isolated killing. But after the sixth victim, investigators finally realized they were dealing with a single offender using the same method each time. There were never any signs of struggle. No witnesses ever saw the attacker clearly, and none of the stones had recoverable fingerprints on them, potentially due to their rough surfaces. The streets were constantly exposed to traffic and the elements, destroying footprints or other potential forensic evidence. Sniffer dogs were brought to several crime scenes, but couldn't pick up a useful trail. There simply wasn't much the detectives could gather with the tools and knowledge they had at the time. It just seemed like someone was moving through the streets at night, silently approaching victims and crushing their skulls, before vanishing back into the darkness. Newspapers soon began referring to the killer as Pathamar, which roughly translates to the Stone Killer. As the number of victims grew, fear began to understandably spread. Streets that were normally busy late into the night emptied early. People who usually went out for early morning walks stopped venturing outside before sunrise. Among the pavement dwellers themselves, the fear was even more immediate. Those who'd previously slept alone began gathering into larger groups, while others took turns staying awake through the night to keep watch for suspicious strangers. But despite these precautions, the killings continued. Over the course of roughly 2 years, at least 12 people were murdered in the exact same brutal manner, though it's been rumoured that there were actually upwards of 25 victims, but that the Bombay police kept the true number low to try and salvage their own reputation. Most of the victims were never identified. Many of them had arrived from other states without family or documents or anything to help investigators figure out who they were. In one instance, an intended victim actually survived an attack. A pavement dweller named Sushil, who worked as a waiter in a small restaurant, later told police that he woke up in the middle of the night after feeling someone standing over him. When he opened his eyes, he briefly saw a man raising a large stone above his head. The attacker hurled the stone downwards, but Sushil managed to move just enough for the rock to strike the side of his head instead of crushing his skull. His scream woke the other pavement dwellers nearby, causing the attacker to immediately flee. Unfortunately, the area's streetlights were not working that night, and Sushil was unable to see the man clearly enough to describe him. According to the Bombay police, they explored a wide range of theories. Some investigators believed the killer must have been mentally unstable and driven by violent impulses they couldn't control. Others suggested they might have been motivated by a hatred towards the homeless, or by some sort of personal grievance or ideological issue with them. I would personally imagine it's more likely that the homeless were targeted for the same reason serial killers target vulnerable people all over the world. Their deaths don't receive the same level of attention. Investigators don't take them as seriously, and it's tragically far easier to kill people who are already invisible. Some even speculated that the killings might have been linked to occult practices or ritualistic beliefs, though no evidence was ever uncovered to back this idea up. Another rumour among some investigators and locals at the time was that the killer might be a police officer or constable. The theory suggested that someone within the police force would have had the knowledge needed to avoid patrols and investigative traps, allowing them to remain one step ahead of the investigation. But like many of the other theories surrounding the case, there was never any evidence to prove it. There was never really any evidence of anything. At one point, investigators focused their attention on a night shift taxi driver named Mohammed. Because he drove around the city late at night and seemed to very specifically stare at pavement dwellers, they quickly grew suspicious of him. Officers briefly considered whether he might have been transporting stones in his vehicle and then using them to carry out the attacks. But the suspicion turned out to be misplaced. The taxi driver was only staring at groups of pavement dwellers because he was actually working as a police informant, helping officers keep watch on the streets during the investigation. Other drifters and petty criminals were detained and interrogated, and other informants were asked to keep watch in neighbourhoods where large numbers of homeless people slept. The police carried out patrols through these same areas. Officers questioned beggars, labourers, and night watchmen, hoping someone might have seen something suspicious. But the city was big and crowded, and none of these lines of inquiry ever led anywhere. Then, just as suddenly as the murders had begun, they stopped. And after months passed without another killing, the investigation gradually lost momentum. The case remained open, but with no suspects and no new leads, it eventually began to fade from the public's attention. But for investigators who had worked the case, one question lingered. If the killer hadn't been caught, then where had he gone? No one could answer that. At least not until 1989, when another pavement dweller was found dead beside a blood-stained stone in the city of Calcutta, and the nightmare began all over again. When Alaya was killed on June 4, 1989 in Calcutta, detectives didn't make any connection to the previous string of murders in Bombay. The killing was disturbing, but in the 1980s, Greater Calcutta was a sprawling metropolis of nearly 10 million people. Some degree of violent crime was just inevitable. And with no suspects or obvious motive, the case quickly went cold. But then, on the morning of July 19th, everything changed. At around 6 in the morning, passers-by stumbled across a body near the Park Street metro station. The victim was a man in his 40s, dressed in a tattered shirt and trousers, who was thin and clearly malnourished. He was another street dweller. Just like in Alaya's case, the right side of his head had been practically caved in, and once again, the blood-covered stone used to kill him was left right next to his body. This time, it was found to weigh nearly 20 kilos. The area was less than 2 miles from where Alea's body had been found and was one of the busiest parts of the city, surrounded by offices and major roads, and even close to several police stations. Officers from the homicide branch had barely begun organising the crime scene photography and forensic examination when another message arrived from the police control room. A second body had been discovered around 3 miles away, next to the subway entrance to the Sealdah railway station. Sealdah station was one of the busiest transport hubs in the city. It served thousands of commuters every day and was surrounded by crowded markets and shops. The victim was a teenage boy, estimated to be around 14 or 15 years old. From the little police could gather immediately, he'd been living and begging on the station footpath. He had also been killed by a single crushing blow from a large stone, which had also been left beside his body. The murders were immediately connected. It seemed far too coincidental that 2 pavement dwellers had been killed in the exact same way, on the exact same night. And now, looking back at the murder of Alea from June, it was clear that they were not dealing with an isolated act of violence, but something much, much more disturbing. Somewhere in the city, there was a killer moving through the streets at night, targeting people who were sleeping on the pavements. Later that morning, Police Chief Prasun Mukherjee summoned an emergency meeting at Lal Bazaar. Present were the Deputy Commissioner of the Detective Department, Rajpal Singh, officers from the Homicide Squad, and the officers in charge of the 3 police stations close to each of the murders: Hare Street, Taltala, and Muchipara. The meeting was tense. Mukherjee went through the murders one by one, intensely questioning every officer involved in the cases, but it quickly became apparent that there were no leads, no witnesses, and no suspects. But there was also no denying that the 3 cases were practically identical, or that they perfectly mirrored the unsolved murders from Bombay that had ended around a year ago. It was clear they were dealing with a serial killer, one who had potentially already perfected his methods over in Bombay. The victims themselves also didn't provide any avenues to explore. They had already looked into every connection Alea had and found nothing. The 2 new victims were unable to be identified at all, and as a result, there were no obvious connections to be traced. No disputes or conflicts with anyone were uncovered, and there was nothing connecting any of them to each other either. As well as identifying whoever had done this, the other issue for the police was trying to work out how they could possibly hope to protect the thousands upon thousands of pavement dwellers on the streets. All 3 of the murders had taken place in some of the busiest and most heavily populated parts of the city, and all of them had occurred not only extremely close to other sleeping street dwellers, but to police stations. Yet somehow, the killer had struck completely unnoticed. Still, the police had little choice but to try and draw up a plan. First, they activated their network of informants, assigning them to watch different areas of the city at night. These sources were given maps, with locations marked where large numbers of pavement dwellers gathered after dark, and they were ordered to report anyone they saw behaving unusually around those areas. Second, the police significantly expanded their own night patrols. They deployed officers in vehicles, on foot, and on bicycles, and every police station in the city was made to participate, sending officers to the central districts where the murders had taken place. Finally, senior officers themselves were ordered to take turns supervising the operations during the night to ensure that the patrols were always active and coordinated. But even with all of these new measures in place, a few weeks later on August 27th, another pavement dweller was found dead, once again near Sealdah station. The body was discovered on the path leading from the station flyover towards the subway entrance. The victim, a beggar believed to be in his mid-30s, had once again been struck on the head with a heavy stone while he slept on the street. And after that discovery, the media began reporting far more aggressively on the case, with newspapers publishing detailed reports about the mysterious attacker targeting the city's most vulnerable. And this is also when they began using the nickname that would become synonymous with the case. In Bombay, the killer had been known as Pathamar, the Stone Killer. But here, English language papers refined the nickname into the Stone Man. The label stuck immediately, and within days, the murders had become one of the most widely discussed topics in the city. But the reaction from the public was complicated. Among the middle and upper classes, the killings produced a sort of strange mixture of curiosity and detachment. Many people believed they had nothing to fear, since the victims were all pavement dwellers. There was a common sentiment at the time that if you had a roof over your head, you were safe. That this was terrifying, sure, but it was happening to them, not us. It's even been claimed that some people genuinely supported the murders, believing that they were the work of a vigilante who was cleaning up the streets. Newspapers began publishing critical commentary, questioning both the police investigation and the broader social indifference towards the victims. Several editorials pointed out that the people being killed were still human beings, even if they lived on the streets and their names were unknown. At the same time, the pressure on the police intensified. Headlines questioned the department's competency, in disbelief that a killer could continue striking in the heart of the city with so many police patrols without being caught. While the press criticism was pretty harsh, even the police didn't see it as entirely unfair. They really hadn't been able to find a single witness or fingerprint or any sort of forensic evidence. They just seemed to have nothing but bodies and stones. Deputy Commissioner Singh began attempting to construct a psychological profile of the attacker. In his view, the killer was likely methodical and intelligent, and had to be physically strong enough to lift the heavy stones used in the attacks. He also had to be capable of blending easily into the crowds that filled the city's streets at night. He believed the murders were most likely driven by a deep-seated hostility toward the pavement dwellers who populated the area. But for those sleeping on the city's streets, the reason he was doing it was almost irrelevant. It didn't change how increasingly terrified they were becoming. Many of them had already lived difficult and dangerous lives, but the idea that someone was deliberately hunting them while they slept created an entirely new kind of fear. Many pavement dwellers began gathering in large groups and organising night watches for protection, just like they'd done previously in Bombay. One group would sleep from around 10 at night until 2 in the morning, while another would stay awake talking and playing cards. Then they would switch. But even these precautions offered little reassurance. The killer had struck repeatedly without being seen. No one could say exactly when he arrived or how he left the crime scenes, and because most of the victims had been asleep when they were attacked, there were no witnesses who could describe what had happened or what he looked like. This led to the terrified pavement dwellers accusing any stranger they saw nearby on the streets at night. Frightened groups began confronting and attacking anyone they believed might be the killer. Some men were captured, tied to lampposts, and beaten bloody, as mobs demanded to know if they were the Stoneman. In many cases, the police had to intervene to stop these altercations from turning into literal public lynchings. Rescuing individuals who'd been wrongly accused and violently assaulted became an almost nightly occurrence for the officers patrolling the streets. The atmosphere in the city was becoming increasingly tense, and yet somehow the killings only seemed to escalate. During the first half of September, 3 more murders were reported in rapid succession. On September 6th, a body was discovered on the northern pavement leading to the Howrah Bridge, the massive crossing that connects Calcutta to the city of Howrah across the Hooghly River, which was less than a mile from Lal Bazar. The victim was believed to be a drifter around 35 years old. The left side of his head had been crushed with a stone weighing close to 20 kilos. Just 2 days later, another victim was discovered with the same injuries. This time the body was found on Old Courthouse Street, which was even closer to Lal Bazar, less than a couple minutes walk away. It was almost as if the killer was mocking the police, purposefully committing murders right outside their own headquarters. Then 3 days after that, a 7th victim was found. This time, he was able to be identified as Tega Rai, a young milk delivery worker. He'd been sleeping on Baithakana Road, not far from Sealdah Station again, and was attacked at around 3 in the morning. But unlike the first 6 victims, Tega was still alive when he was discovered. His vest was soaked with blood from the massive head wound that had been inflicted by the stone, and he was barely conscious. He was rushed to Calcutta Medical College Hospital, and for the first time the police were hopeful that they might finally be able to get a description of their killer. But despite the doctor's best efforts, Tega never regained consciousness, and he died 48 hours later. With the death of Tega, 7 almost identical murders had now taken place in just over 3 months. The entire city was gripped by what the newspapers began calling Stoneman phobia. Rumours spread that the killings were actually the work of a large group, working together. Others claimed that a cult was behind the murders, and that it was all part of some sort of twisted ritual. For the Calcutta police themselves, the situation was unprecedented. They had long enjoyed a national reputation for solving complex cases. They were even known as the Scotland Yard of the East. But here they were, confronting a killer who had struck repeatedly in the centre of the city, often within walking distance of their police stations, and they had literally nothing, not even a single lead or clue. The case was no longer just being discussed in newspapers. It made its way into the West Bengal State Assembly and eventually even into the Indian Parliament. International media also began to take notice. Publications like The Guardian in the UK published short articles on India's unsolved Stoneman killings. As police significantly expanded their patrols, detectives were made to work long hours, often patrolling the streets at night, before returning to their desks during the day to review case files and interview witnesses. They even brought in the government railway police to help provide surveillance at the major railway stations, particularly Howrah and Sealdah. This was in case the killer was using the railway network to move in and out of the city unnoticed. Some officers became so desperate to catch the killer that they even began trying out unusual and dangerous strategies. One officer later recalled encountering a suspicious man alone at night during a patrol near Sealdah station. The man was lying on the pavement with his head covered by a sheet, peering cautiously at people passing nearby. When the officer approached him and pulled off the sheet, he shone his flashlight in his face, only to realise that he was looking at the officer in charge of the Muchipara police station. The senior officer had decided to lie down among the pavement dwellers himself, pretending to sleep, in the hope that the stone man might approach him. And he was not alone. Other officers had begun doing the same thing in different parts of the city, positioning themselves among groups of sleeping pavement dwellers and waiting silently for hours in the darkness, hoping the killer might reveal himself. At the same time, police began conducting large-scale sweeps of areas where homeless people slept. Hundreds of people were detained and questioned in connection with the murders. Most of these individuals were released within hours or days, once it became clear they had nothing to do with the crimes, or at least there was nothing at all tying them to them. These aggressive tactics soon drew criticism. Human rights groups began protesting the police operations, accusing officers of rounding up defenseless street people and beating or torturing unlikely suspects who could not possibly have been responsible for the murders. Within Lal Bazaar itself, disagreements also started to emerge about who they were even looking for. Police Chief Mukherjee and Deputy Commissioner Singh had developed sharply different ideas about the killer and how to catch him. Singh continued refining his psychological profile, convinced the attacker was a calculating predator who moved carefully through the city at night. Mukherjee, however, believed another possibility could not be ruled out, that the murders might be connected to tantric rituals involving human sacrifice. Some investigators pointed out that many of the killings had occurred on either Tuesday or Saturday nights, which are traditionally associated with worship of the goddess Kali, a powerful figure in tantric traditions. While there was never any evidence linking the murders to such rituals, the idea gained traction among many officers during the investigation, including the police chief. This created a bit of a divide within the investigation. Some officers were searching for Singh's calculating predator, others were looking out for a fanatic carrying out some kind of ritual sacrifice. Either way, nobody seemed to fit either of these profiles. At least, not until one night towards the end of September, when officers spotted a suspicious-looking man walking alone along Bepin Bahari Ganguly Street near Sealdah Station. He was thin and unkempt and appeared to be a vagrant, somewhere close to 50 years old. His movements were slow, and he didn't seem to be going anywhere in particular, just wandering. So the officers approached him and asked him to identify himself. He calmly told them that his name was Dunya Malik, which translated roughly as the Lord of the World. The officers pushed the suspicious man to stop messing around and give them his real name. So he told them that his birth name was Muhammad Ekram, if that's what they wanted to hear, but that his real name was Dunya Malik. When asked where he lived, he responded that the whole world was his home. Losing patience, they pushed further, asking where he sleeps at night. Again, he gave a bizarre answer. He said, "I don't sleep, sir. I roam around the pavements. There are so many people in the Lord of the World's domain without a roof over their heads. I roam around and see them all." The officers looked at each other, growing increasingly uncomfortable. Then one of them finally responded. "You see them all," he said slowly, "and then you kill them with stones." According to the officers, Ekram didn't react with anger or fear at the accusation. Instead, he gave them a calm, almost philosophical reply. He said, "I am the Lord of the World. Why would I kill, sir? But look at the people who spend their nights on the pavements. Is this kind of life worth living, sir?" At that point, the officers made their decision. It was as close to a motive or confession as anything they'd gotten so far. so they placed him in their patrol car and brought him to Lal Bazaar for questioning. Throughout his preceding interrogation, Ekram continued to give strange answers to every question he was asked. At times he seemed incoherent, drifting into rants about power and destiny. At other moments he spoke quite normally, answering questions about his past with surprising clarity. Gradually, he revealed that he had originally come from Sitamarhi, a district in the state of Bihar. Nearly 25 years earlier, he'd arrived in Calcutta with his father, Muhammad Isha, who worked as a labourer. After his father's death, Ekram had drifted across the city, moving from place to place and surviving largely on the streets, relying on occasional handouts or small odd jobs. To the investigators, the possibility that the killer might be someone who already lived on the streets made a certain kind of sense. Such a person would understand the habits of other pavement dwellers. He'd know where they slept and where he would be unlikely to be seen or disturbed. He'd even be able to move through the streets without attracting any real attention if he was already known to other vagrants. Although it seemed clear to the detectives that he was likely suffering from some sort of mental illness, it also seemed clear to them that he was the first strong suspect they'd come across in the investigation. Talking to other vagrants, they learnt that Ekram was often seen walking through the city at night by himself, and he'd regularly been seen lingering near groups of sleeping pavement dwellers, watching them silently. This seemed to perfectly fit the sort of behaviour they imagined their killer might display. Later that day, Deputy Commissioner Singh met with Police Chief Mukherjee to discuss the situation. Ekram had not confessed to anything, but his behaviour was undoubtedly strange, and the Lord of the World name he'd given himself suggested a grandiose sense of power and control. Some of the investigators believed that could align with the mindset of a killer who attacked the helpless while they slept. But there was a major problem. Ekram was extremely frail and thin. Many of the stones used in the murders weighed upwards of 20 kilos, and Ekram just didn't look like he would be physically capable of lifting them and carrying out the attacks. Singh openly doubted that Ekram was the stone man, but Mukherjee decided that he should remain in custody regardless, so they could learn more about his mental state. A psychological evaluation was arranged, and he continued to undergo questioning in the hopes that he might eventually reveal something incriminating, or even confess. And if he was truly the stone man, Mukherjee argued, then it wouldn't be long before they'd have their answer. Because if he was in custody, and he was the killer, then the murders would soon stop, and if they didn't, then they'd know they had the wrong man. A few days passed without another body being discovered. Then a couple of weeks. For the detectives who'd been struggling for months to make progress in the case, it finally seemed like they might be onto something. But that optimism didn't last. In the early hours of October 19th, a call came into Lal Bazaar stating that the body of another pavement dweller had been found in the same area as the others, this time near R. Ahmed Dental College, close to an electrical transformer. Like all the previous victims, his skull had been crushed by a heavy stone while he slept. Some detectives believed that Ekram could still somehow be involved, proposing that he might be part of a group carrying out the murders. But for most, it seemed clear that the man who called himself Lord of the World was strange and unstable, but not the stone man. So after weeks of being held and interrogated, Ekram was eventually released without charge. The real killer was still out there, and despite the intense police presence at night, he was still managing to murder right under their noses. To many officers, it felt like they were trying to catch a ghost. A month later, on November 26th, the body of another pavement dweller was discovered near the Sealdar flyover subway, close to Nil Ratan Sircar Hospital. The victim was a man in his 40s. And once again, there was no evidence, no witnesses, nothing. And then the killing seemed to stop. With no explanation or reason the detectives could determine, no further victims were discovered. For 2 whole months anyway. Because then, on January 29th, 1990, the stone man struck again. The 10th victim was one of the rare few to ever be identified. Her name was Shanti Manna, and she was around 35 years old. Her body was discovered on the pavement of Prafulla Sarkar Street, which was not only a short walk from Lal Bazaar again, but it was actually right outside the offices of one of the local newspapers, Ananda Bazar Patrika. Inquiries revealed that Shanti was a sex worker whose husband had died some time earlier. She spent most of her nights working and sleeping on the pavements. Like the others, her skull had been crushed with a large stone. By that point, many police officers had given up hopes of ever catching the stone man. The tone of conversations apparently shifted in some of the local departments from how to identify the killer to where the next body would turn up. Some officers even began turning to superstition for answers. One senior investigator was said to have consulted an astrologer in the hopes of learning how the killer operated and when the killings would come to an end. The astrologer reportedly declared that the Stoneman had a long, strange stride which he likened to a wading bird, and claimed that his capture was imminent. This information was taken as gospel by some of the officers. And while that's pretty wild to think about, they didn't exactly have anything else to focus on. According to one officer, one of his inspectors became convinced he'd spotted the Stoneman near the High Court, simply because he walked in an odd bird-like way. The man was arrested on that single observation, but he was determined to just be a harmless hardware store owner, and was soon released with an apology and a cup of tea. The 11th murder came exactly 21 days after Shanti's body was found. Up until that point, the Stoneman's killings had all been confined to the same general areas in central Calcutta, and that was where the vast majority of police patrols had been taking place, not that they seemed to have made any difference. But on February 20th, the next victim was discovered in South Calcutta on a main road near the Bekbagan crossing. He was known locally as Mastan and was a beggar in his late 30s. As usual, his head had been caved in with a heavy stone left at the scene. But for the first time in the entire case, the Stoneman actually left something else behind at the scene this time. Footprints. The stone used in the attack was found about 4 yards from the body in a sewer. As far as detectives could tell, the killer appeared to have moved the stone after the murder for reasons unknown. And in doing so, he stepped in the victim's blood, leaving 3 shoe prints from his left foot and 9 from his right. Experts rushed to collect what they could. While the left prints were too blurred and distorted to be useful, the right prints were intact enough to finally offer a few clues. First, experts were able to determine that the prints likely belonged to someone who was of medium build and not especially tall or broad, based on the shoe size, print depth, and stride length. Second, they revealed that the suspect had an exceptionally long big toe on his right foot. If these conclusions were correct, they implied that the Stoneman might not be as big and powerfully built as some of the investigators had suspected. While in reality these findings didn't have much practical use, they did at least give detectives something to compare potential suspects to. In particular, the exceptionally long big toe on the right foot was something they would be able to look for on anyone they detained moving forwards. Somewhat strangely, this detail did potentially align with the astrologer's claims about the killer having an unusual walk. But regardless, before the police had any chance to make much use of this new information, the Stoneman struck again. 5 days after Mastan's body was found, on February 26th, another body was discovered, once again close to Sealdar Station. This time, the victim was a boy of 15 or 16 who'd been surviving by begging and sleeping on the station premises. It was the 12th murder committed by the Stoneman in Calcutta, and it would also be the last. In the first week of March, just as pressure on the state government and the Calcutta police was reaching its peak, a message crackled over the police wireless network late one night. Stoneman caught red-handed near Sealdar, being brought to Lal Bazar. Within minutes, detectives and senior officers began rushing to the police headquarters, shocked that the killer may have finally been caught. The man brought in for questioning didn't look like the terrifying figure many had imagined. He was nearly 50 years old, of medium build, calm, and even slightly bewildered by what was going on. He told them that his name was Kalipada Das, and he worked for the state government in the Department of Sports and Youth Welfare. His posting was in the Bankura district, several hours away from Calcutta. But according to the patrol officers that had detained him near Baithakana Market, he'd been found lying beside a woman sleeping on the pavement, raising a stone above her head, seemingly about to strike her. As far as the officers were concerned, they had caught the Stoneman in the act. But almost immediately, small details raised doubts for the detectives. The weapon recovered was not a heavy stone like those used in the murders. It was just a simple brick, the kind that might cause injury, but not the kind that had crushed the skulls of 12 victims. And the man himself insisted that he'd done nothing wrong. He told the investigators he'd travelled to Calcutta to attend a political meeting near Sealdar Station. When the event ended, train services were delayed because of a mechanical problem, leaving him stranded overnight. With nowhere else to go, he decided to sleep on the pavement, like many others nearby. According to his account, the woman beside him had suddenly woken up and started crying out in fear when she noticed a stranger lying next to her. Embarrassed and annoyed, he picked up a nearby brick and threatened her with it, hoping to scare her into silence. When detectives returned to the scene to investigate, witnesses supported his story. The woman was quickly identified as a deaf and mute pavement dweller who'd been startled when she woke and saw him lying beside her. Police also confirmed that a political gathering had taken place outside Sealdah Station that evening and that train services had been disrupted for several hours. And further inquiries revealed another crucial detail. Kalipada had a history of mental instability. At times he behaved completely normally, but at others he drifted into strange fantasies, imagining himself to be a soldier in the army of Subhas Chandra Bose during the Second World War. When investigators checked his work attendance records and travel history, the results were conclusive. On the dates of the murders, he had been either at home or at work, far from Calcutta. To eliminate any remaining doubt, police compared his footprints with the prints discovered at the 11th murder scene. They didn't match, so Kalipada was dismissed as a suspect and released, like everyone else before him. He was not the Stoneman. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and no new victims were discovered. At first, police remained cautious. After all, the killings had never followed an obvious schedule. Sometimes multiple victims had been found within days. Other times, months had passed before another victim was discovered. This made it seem like the Stoneman had not been acting impulsively or randomly, but instead had been watching the investigation unfold and the public response, and adjusting his behaviour accordingly. Perhaps when patrols had been too intense, he'd waited for them to relax. And when police finally felt like they were regaining some sense of control over the situation, he would murder right on their own doorstep to show who was truly the one controlling things. If any of this was true, it could have just meant that the Stoneman was patiently waiting for the police and the public to relax before he struck again. But as more and more time passed without another attack, it eventually became apparent that something had changed. The Stoneman had vanished. It was an almost exact replica of what had happened in Bombay back in 1985. A dozen people had been murdered with stones as they slept on the street at night, and then the killer had just disappeared, leaving no real evidence or clues behind. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore, and the fact that the Bombay murders stopped in mid-1988 and the Calcutta murders began less than a year later in mid-1989 made the connection hard to dismiss. But because of the complete lack of evidence, there was never any definitive proof that the same Stoneman was responsible for both series of murders. And it was entirely possible that a second serial killer in Calcutta had been inspired by the first in Bombay. After all, not only was the method used extremely easy to imitate, but anyone following the Bombay murder series would have seen how helpless and clueless the police were. Eventually, life in Calcutta slowly began to return to normal. The police patrols that had once moved constantly through the city at night were gradually reduced. The emergency meetings inside Lal Bazaar became less frequent, and as time passed without another body appearing on the pavements, the sense of immediate danger began to fade. No further evidence was discovered. No suspects were found who matched the prints taken from the 11th crime scene. The killings were seemingly over, but the mystery of who was responsible and why they had done it was not. And then, nearly a decade later, the Stoneman appeared to have returned yet again. In 1999, police in the city of Berhampur in the eastern Indian state of Odisha began investigating a series of killings that immediately sounded familiar. One after another, pavement dwellers were being murdered in the middle of the night while they slept. And just like before, each victim had had their skull crushed with a large stone. As the bodies began to accumulate, the resemblance to the now infamous killings of the 1980s quickly drew attention. Rumours spread that the Stoneman was back. But then something very different happened from the first two murder series. After 6 victims had been discovered, the killer was caught as he attempted to claim his 7th life, attacking a rickshaw puller with a large stone. His name was Maheshwar Paddy, and he was a local pawn shop owner. But while it might have seemed like the Stoneman had finally been found at long last, it was a little bit more complicated than that. Maheshwar was in his early 20s, which meant that when the original Stoneman murders were taking place in Bombay and Calcutta during the 80s, he was only a child. It seemed that in reality, he was a copycat killer, modelling his crimes on the older unsolved murder cases. He denied any wrongdoing, but enough witnesses had seen him attacking the rickshaw puller that he was charged with attempted murder. He also failed a lie detector test, leading detectives to feel confident he was responsible for the other 6 murders, even if they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with them. Maheshwar actually managed to escape custody by jumping out of a moving train while being moved between locations, but after a 3-month manhunt, he was eventually rearrested, and he was later sentenced to 10 years in prison for the attempted murder that could be proven. The killings did stop after his arrest, but whether he was truly responsible for these 6 new murders was never able to be determined. Over the following years, several more cases of Stoneman-style murder sprees appeared across India, and each time they did, the same questions returned. Had the original killer resurfaced? Or was it another copycat imitating his methods? One of the most alarming examples occurred in the northeastern city of Guwahati in 2009. Once again, pavement dwellers were murdered while they slept, by a heavy stone being dropped or slammed on their heads. The Stoneman label was applied almost immediately by the media. But after 11 people had been killed, Krishna Timong was arrested and openly confessed to being the serial killer. He was only 22 years old, which again meant he could not have been responsible for the earlier Bombay and Calcutta cases. Krishna was a drug addict who'd been living around the city's railway station area. He had previously worked in a job that involved removing bodies from railway tracks and other accident scenes, which perhaps had allowed him to become disturbingly familiar with death. Just a few years later, in 2013, another series of similar killings began in the western Indian city of Kolhapur, in the state of Maharashtra. In less than 4 months, 10 people were murdered, and just like the earlier attacks, the victims were all people sleeping outdoors and were all killed in the same brutally simple way: a heavy stone brought down onto their heads while they slept. Despite having more modern investigative tools in their arsenal, police struggled to identify the killer, and as with all the other instances, rumours that the original Stoneman had returned ran rampant. Police employed a wide range of unusual tactics to catch the killer, including placing decoys and mannequins on pavements to try and lure him out. Eventually, 35-year-old Dilip Loharia was arrested, and in custody he supposedly confessed to the murders. However, it's worth pointing out that in this instance, the state's Deputy Minister for Home, Satej Patil, who was from the city, had demanded results in the case. He gave a deadline and threatened to transfer the city's police superintendent if he failed to catch the killer by it. It was only after this threat that Dilip was miraculously caught, despite not having had a single lead in the previous 4 months. And there are claims that he arrived to court badly bruised and beaten, so whether he was truly the killer in this instance is again unclear. And while it's unlikely the original Stoneman was still active 3 decades later, it isn't impossible. There were also other incidents all over the country over the years. In Pune, several pavement dwellers were murdered in the same manner. In Rajkot, another small cluster of Stoneman-style killings occurred. Even in Calcutta, or Kolkata as it had become known, isolated cases occasionally appeared where a homeless victim was found with their skull crushed by a stone. Every time a similar case occurred, the name Stoneman returned. But by then, most investigators had come to believe that these crimes were no longer the work of the serial killer who had evaded them all those years ago. Instead, they believed they were something that's almost more unsettling. It was like the original murders had created a blueprint, a method that required no money, no special weapon, no complicated planning, and almost no risk of being traced. Anyone could pick up a stone. Anyone could attack a sleeping victim. Ultimately, none of these new cases brought investigators any closer to identifying who the original Stoneman was, if he was even one singular person. To this day, his identity remains unknown. And perhaps more tragically, so do the identities of the vast majority of his victims. Most of them were people who had already slipped through the cracks of society long before they were killed. When they died, there were often few people left to speak for them, and that anonymity may have been the Stoneman's greatest advantage. For the detectives trying to solve the case all those years ago in Calcutta, one thing had never quite made sense to them. How had the Stoneman been able to continue committing these murders so openly, despite the constant patrols and surveillance? Every night, officers were combing the streets. Informants were watching all the areas where pavement dwellers gathered. Groups of homeless people were sleeping in shifts, keeping watch for any strangers, and even attacking anyone they saw walking alone. So what if the killer wasn't finding a way to approach his victims? What if he was instead lying down right beside them, pretending to be asleep? Pretending to be another anonymous, invisible person? and waiting for the city to fall silent, waiting for the moment when everyone else was asleep. And then, when the time was right, rising quietly from the darkness, lifting a stone and striking. If that theory was true, it would explain something that had puzzled investigators from the very beginning. Why no one had ever seen the stone man coming? Because he was already there. And with that, our deep dive into the unsolved case of India's stone man comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to do all the little rituals the algorithm gods demand of you: liking, commenting, hyping, subscribing, and so on. If you like what I do and want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked down below too. I don't have a lot to offer if you join either of them, beyond my unconditional thanks. But you do get to see your name at the end of my videos if you do, alongside all the lovely folks popping up on screen in a few seconds. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. September 15th, 1986. Hwaseong in the Gyeonggi province of South Korea is nothing like the industrial city it will later become. It's rural, made up of farmland and small factories pressed side by side. Women walk home alone from bus stops after late shifts. Even though there's barely any streetlights along the dirt paths and irrigation ditches that wind through the countryside, it feels safe. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. It's not the kind of place where violent crime happens. It's not a place that expects horror. But that day, 71-year-old Lee Won-im begins the short walk home after visiting her daughter in Anyong-ri, and disappears. 4 days later, her body is found in a field. At first glance, investigators consider the possibility of a hit and run. Her clothing is in disarray, and she's not found too far from the road. And because she's elderly, there is no immediate assumption of sexual violence. At least, not until the autopsy comes back. Because it reveals signs that are consistent with attempted sexual assault, though no semen is detected. It also reveals that she didn't die from any sort of impact trauma. She was strangled to death with her own clothing. But still, it isn't treated too seriously. Only 3 detectives are assigned to the case. At the time, South Korea is preparing for the 1986 Asian Games, which is a major international event. And as a result, police are heavily focused on security concerns for the event, with many rural officers shifted to Seoul, so resources are extremely limited. The scene is rural, open and difficult to secure, and evidence collection in 1986 South Korea relies heavily on basic physical examination and witness canvassing. There is no national DNA database. There is no centralized forensic system. The detectives find no witnesses, no reports of a scream, and at first it's just seen as a terrible but isolated crime, and it's assumed to be the work of an outsider, or a robbery gone wrong. But then weeks later, another woman is found dead, then another, and then another. Within 3 months, 4 women are dead. The victims are young and old. They are attacked alone, often at night, often along narrow paths connecting bus stops to their homes. In most cases, they are killed with something they were already wearing: stockings, socks, pantyhose, twisted tight around the neck. The crimes are intimate, controlled, repeated. and soon a rumor will start to spread that all of the women were wearing red when they were killed, and that they were attacked on rainy days. 10 women will die between 1986 and 1991 in and around this rural district of Hwaseong. Over time, more than 20,000 men will be investigated. Hundreds of hair samples will be collected. Tens of thousands of fingerprints taken. Blood types will be recorded. Investigators will describe it as casting a fishing net over the entire region and hoping they catch something. Over 2 million man-hours will be spent working the case. Officers from across the entire province will be deployed. A dedicated investigation headquarters will form. But the killer will not be caught. And by 2006, the statute of limitations on the crimes will expire, meaning he couldn't be charged, even if they did find him. For more than 3 decades, the Hwaseong serial murders will stand as the most infamous unsolved case in South Korean history. It will be studied in classrooms, whispered about in the villages, and immortalized in film by one of the nation's greatest filmmakers. And that's where it will sit, a disturbing, unsolvable mystery. But then, in 2019, something miraculous will happen. Degraded DNA preserved in evidence lockers will finally reveal the truth. And after so long, the monster responsible will finally be identified. But at the time, the investigators have no idea who this man is. They don't realize how close they are to him all along. They don't know that he lives within the radius they're searching, or that they'll arrest him in 1994 for a separate murder and still fail to connect him to the case. They don't know that an innocent man will spend 20 years in prison for one of these murders. In 1986, all they know is this: an elderly woman lies dead in a field. Another woman is found in a canal. 2 more in rice paddies before the year is out. Hwaseong is quiet. The roads are dark. The buses still run on schedule. And somewhere inside that quiet landscape, a man is watching and waiting. This is the story of the Hwaseong murderer. Before we get back into the case, I just want to say that if you find this video interesting, don't forget to like and comment, as that sort of early engagement really helps the video out. Same goes for subscribing if you're new here. The algorithm gods take all that sort of stuff pretty seriously and see it as a sign that the video might be worth showing to other people, so it really does make a difference. I've wanted to cover this case for some time. Those who've been watching my channel for a while might remember that when I covered China's red dress killer, I mentioned I'd initially confused it with a much more famous case involving victims wearing red, and it was kindly pointed out to me that I was probably thinking of this case. I actually didn't know too much about the case at the time, but it was definitely its depiction in the movie Memories of Murder that had been stuck in my mind. Anyway, I'll stop rambling now. My script for this one is massive, so I suspect it's going to be a long one by the time I'm done putting it together, so let's jump straight back into it. In the mid-1980s, Hwaseong County was in transition. South Korea's economy was expanding rapidly. Factories producing light bulbs, electrical goods, and industrial components were rising along the outskirts of farmland. But Taean-up and the surrounding townships in the county still retained the rhythm of agricultural life. Rice paddies bordered narrow paths. Bus routes connected factory zones to villages. Many women commuted by foot from bus stops to their homes after late shifts. And these bus stops were not surrounded by buildings or businesses. They were often marked by little more than a signpost along a narrow road cutting through farmland. From there, people walked. There were long stretches without lighting. That geography mattered. The first victim, found on September 15, 1986, had walked these paths before. The area where her body was discovered was not remote wilderness. It was semi-isolated farmland, close enough to routine, far enough from immediate help. 4 weeks after her body was discovered, on October 20, 1986, a 25-year-old woman stepped off a bus in Jinan-ri at around roughly 10 p.m. Her name was Park Hyun-suk, and she had been returning home from Songtan, where she'd met a prospective marriage partner. 3 days later, her body was discovered near a canal. Like the first victim, she'd been sexually assaulted and strangled, once again with her own clothing. Stockings were wrapped and tied tightly. Underwear had been forced into her mouth as a gag. There were signs she'd been bound from behind, her hands secured using what she'd been wearing. Investigators collected everything they could find: hair, fibers, soil samples, cigarette butts that were discovered nearby, 2 discarded milk cartons, and this time, semen was actually recovered. In the absence of DNA technology, forensic testing focused on the only thing it could determine: blood type, which in this case was believed to have come from a male with blood type B. It was a limited but significant detail. From that point forward, the phrase type B male began circulating internally within the investigation. It would eventually become more than a forensic note. It would become an assumption. At this stage, however, even this second case was still treated as an isolated crime. Serial murders were virtually unheard of in South Korea in the mid-1980s. There was no established profile framework, no precedent. The public didn't even really understand what a serial killer was. And so within law enforcement, the first case wasn't labelled Case 1. It was just a murder. The second was another murder. A coincidence, perhaps. But realistically, the pattern was undeniable. Within a month, there had been 2 almost identical murders. Both victims had been attacked while walking along isolated routes between bus stops and their homes. They'd both been sexually assaulted and strangled with their own clothing. Their bodies were not concealed, but left out in the open, in areas likely right by where they were attacked. There was no indication they'd been specifically targeted because of a personal grudge or anything like that. There was no obvious personal connection between the victims either. Then in November, something unexpected happened. A woman in her 30s was walking home late at night in the same general area when a man appeared out of nowhere and grabbed her from behind. He dragged her off the path and used her stockings to tie her arms behind her back. As with the first 2 murders, he then began assaulting her. But in this instance, he then asked her to hand over any money she had. Thinking fast, she told him that her money was in her bag, which she dropped when he grabbed her. He left her lying on the floor to go back and look for her bag in the darkness. So wasting no time, she forced herself to her feet and ran as fast as she could to somewhere she knew there would be other people. Screaming for help to draw their attention, residents rushed over to help her, giving chase to her attacker, who quickly vanished back into the darkness. As a result, she and the residents were able to give the police a brief description of the man who'd attacked her. He was said to be in his mid-20s, of average build, and approximately 165 to 170 centimeters tall. Though it was dark, she also described him as having a short, sports-cut hairstyle and sharp-looking eyes. By December, the pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. On December 12th, at around 11 p.m., 25-year-old factory worker Kwon Jung-bon was attacked in Anyong-ri on her way home, though her body wasn't actually discovered for a number of months. She had been bound and gagged with her own stockings, and her underwear had been placed over her face. Like the first 2 victims, she had been strangled and assaulted, with semen being recovered again. 2 days later, on December 14th, 23-year-old Lee Kai-suk stepped off a bus at around 11 p.m, having also been out meeting a prospective marriage partner. Her body was discovered 5 days later on a ridge between rice fields. Her hands had been tied, she had been strangled, a girdle had been pulled over her face, and she had been assaulted. Semen was also recovered from the scene. Within 3 months, 4 women had been murdered, and the geographic radius was tight. All of the murders had taken place within a roughly 2-kilometer radius around Tai'an. The victims had been attacked along routes that connected bus stops to residential areas. At night, those trails were nearly invisible from a distance. Someone waiting along them could remain concealed until the last moment. Even though the idea of a serial killer was unthinkable to the investigators at the time, it was impossible to ignore the similarities. These were clearly the acts of one specific individual. But at the time, there were no surveillance cameras, no mobile phone tracking. DNA profiling had begun to emerge in Western countries, but South Korea lacked the capability to conduct comprehensive DNA analysis. So even the biological samples they had collected and stored couldn't tell them anything, other than that their suspect likely had type B blood. The investigation had to rely on evidence they could gather at the crime scenes, door-to-door questioning, any witness accounts, and shoe print casts they'd made from the scenes, though contamination from farm machinery and bystanders made it difficult to know if they belonged to their suspect or not. It was an extremely labour-intensive investigation. Using the statements from the survivor and other witnesses, they began drafting a profile and sketch of their potential suspect. The murders had not yet reached national headlines, but in Tai'an they were already changing behaviour. Hwaseong was no longer simply farmland. It was a place where women were being hunted. On January 10, 1987, the killer struck again. This time, he targeted 18-year-old high schooler Hong Jin-young as she was walking home. As with the other cases, she had been assaulted and strangled to death with her own clothes. Her socks had been used as a gag, and once again, semen was recovered. A couple of months later, in April, the decomposed body of victim number 3, Kwon Jung-bon, was discovered. And the following month in May, a 6th victim was found. Park Yun-ju had gone out with an umbrella to meet her husband after work on May 2nd, before she vanished. Her body was found a week later on a hill in Jinan-ri, reportedly by children. Again, it was in the same general area, and she had been assaulted, strangled, and murdered in the same manner. With 6 victims all exhibiting identical signatures, the police response expanded dramatically. A dedicated investigation headquarters was formed to focus on the case, and officers across the entire province were reassigned to help with the investigation. What started out as a 3-man team expanded into hundreds. Thousands of men were questioned, with blood, hair, and fingerprints taken, all of which had to be manually catalogued. The Type B blood idea became a central part of the case. It was seen as one of the strongest forensic indicators the investigators had, and the idea that their killer had to have Type B blood was accepted as fact. Men were suspected or dismissed because of it. They also scrutinized hair samples for traces of heavy metals, since titanium was detected in a hair sample recovered from one of the crime scenes. They speculated this could imply that the suspect might work as a welder or something similar, so anyone with that sort of job was scrutinized too. But essentially, they investigated pretty much every man within the region. It wasn't refined or specific. As they themselves described it, they were throwing a net out and hoping it pulled something in. The pressure on the police only intensified as the murders gained an increasing amount of attention in the media, who began describing it as the greatest unsolved mystery since the founding of the nation. Many investigators later said they feared they would lose their jobs if they failed to catch the perpetrator. But that fear was nothing compared to what the people of Hwaseong were feeling. The entire community began to change. Taeyanup was known as a close-knit township. Many residents worked in nearby factories. Others farmed rice or tended livestock. In the evenings, people gathered at rice wine bars or Korean-style coffee shops to talk. Now those gatherings ended early, or didn't happen at all. Women avoided walking alone after dark. Factory workers coordinated shifts so they could leave together in groups. Parents escorted daughters to bus stops. Men formed volunteer patrol groups, armed with sticks and flashlights, walking the same dirt paths the killer was believed to use. Some locals even erected a scarecrow as a talisman to ward off the killer. And rumours spread quickly. One of the most persistent was that the killer was targeting women wearing red clothing. There was no actual evidence that this was true, but it was seen as a fact by the public. Women stopped wearing red. Some wouldn't even wear bright colours for fear it would attract the killer. Even men stopped going out in public at night, not because they were necessarily worried they would be attacked, but because they feared police might mistake them for suspects during sweeps. And the police sweeps were intense. Officers were deployed in pairs, spaced roughly every 100 meters along key routes. They walked the same paths the killer was believed to use. Some female officers were even made to wear red clothing, hoping to lure the suspect out. None of it worked. The police grew increasingly desperate. Some investigators consulted clairvoyants, who made all sorts of wild claims that didn't help the investigation. For example, one told them that the killer was missing a finger. He wasn't. Another directed them towards a specific man who had nothing to do with the crimes. And then suddenly, the killings seemed to just stop. After the 6th murder on May 2nd, 1987, nothing happened for well over a year. At least nothing that the investigators connected to the case at the time. The absence didn't bring comfort, though. It brought unease. The killer clearly hadn't been caught. So where was he? By late 1988, the investigation had grown into one of the largest in South Korean history. Over time, more than 2 million man-days would be dedicated to the case, the equivalent of thousands of officers working continuously for years. Hundreds of DNA and hair samples were collected and preserved, even though analysis capabilities were limited. Then, after a year and a half of silence, on September 7, 1988, at approximately 9:30 p.m., 54-year-old Ahn Gi-soon stepped off a bus, returning home. Her body was discovered the following morning along a canal. There was no question that the same killer was responsible, despite the long pause. She had been bound and gagged with her own clothing. She had been assaulted, and she had been strangled. This time, Alongside semen, peach slices were reportedly found inside her body. It's believed the victim had the peaches on her when she was attacked, having purchased them for her husband. And in many ways, as odd as this detail seemed to be, it wasn't really a deviation. It was another instance of the killer using whatever was at the scene during his disturbing attacks. Around this time, several other witnesses emerged with potential details about the suspect. The first came from a bus driver who picked up a suspicious man in the area on the very same night that Ahn Gi-soon was murdered. He claimed the man was frantic when he waved him down and was covered in mud, and something about him just didn't seem right. Alongside the previous survivor's account, he helped develop a more detailed sketch of the man he'd seen. Like the previous witness, he described him as in his mid-20s and of average build. He also emphasized his short haircut and sharp eyes. Not long after, a woman using an outdoor toilet late at night reported a terrifying encounter. In traditional Korean homes at the time, toilets were often separate from the main building. They were typically simple structures with a paper-covered door and a hook latch. While using the toilet, she sensed movement outside. She looked up, and suddenly the door opened to reveal a figure standing in the doorway. She said that he advanced on her quickly, covering her face, but the whole encounter was brief, because as she screamed, he moved back and fled. When shown the composite sketch, she reacted immediately, identifying it as the same man she'd seen, which was seen as proof that the sketch was a reasonably accurate depiction of the suspect. She also added a detail that intrigued investigators. She described the man's hands as soft. And in an area where most men worked in agricultural or manual trades, soft hands suggested that their suspect might not work in a physical role like that. The sketch was plastered everywhere, not just locally, but across the entire nation. But just as it seemed like some progress was finally being made, 10 days later, the case changed entirely. Because the next attack didn't happen along a dirt road or beside a rice field. It happened inside a home, and the victim was only 13 years old. Park Sang-hee had been sleeping alone in her family's house in Jinan-ri. At the time, many rural homes in the area used traditional sliding doors made of thin wooden frames covered in paper. They provided privacy, but they didn't provide security. The doors were secured by simple hook-style latches that could, in some cases, be manipulated from the outside. At some point during the night, the door to her room was opened. There was no evidence of forced entry in the conventional sense. The paper had been torn. The latch had been lifted. It suggested familiarity with the structure, knowledge of how to enter without breaking wood or making significant noise. She was assaulted and strangled, using fabric from within the bedroom. As in the prior cases, binding and gagging were involved. So the method was consistent with the earlier crimes, but the location was not. The perpetrator had moved from open farmland to an occupied home. When the body was discovered the following morning, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Until that point, the prevailing fear had centered on women walking alone at night. Bus stops, dirt paths, irrigation ditches. In a way, there was a grim logic to that vulnerability. You were alone. You were exposed. But a home was supposed to be safe. And this was a child. Public outrage intensified in a way that had not occurred before. The case was no longer seen as a rural anomaly. It was a national emergency. Media coverage expanded. National outlets carried the story prominently. The phrase serial murder became common in reporting. The idea that a predator could enter a bedroom without detection unsettled the entire country. Public criticism also mounted. Many questioned how so many murders could occur in such a small area without resolution. The country had never seen anything like it before. And all of this put even more pressure on the police to solve the case. And the more desperate they became, the more mistakes they began to make. In July of 1989, a 22-year-old farming machine repairman named Yoon Sung-yu was brought in for questioning. He had been questioned in the past. Most men who lived in the general area had. However, after the latest murder and the attention it brought to the case, the investigators were desperate to find the man responsible. And as far as they were concerned, Yoon ticked a lot of boxes for them. He lived locally to the crimes in Taean-up. He had type B blood, which they were convinced their killer had to have. He worked a job that involved welding, which it had been suggested their killer might. And importantly, he fit their growing psychological profile. They had constructed a theory that their killer was socially isolated, held deep resentment towards women, and was likely marginalized in some way. It was a theory, not evidence. But Yoon Sung-yu seemed to fit the theory. He walked with a limp as a result of childhood polio, which had also exempted him from military service. He lived an isolated life. He was vulnerable, and he was different. Yoon had grown up without stability. His mother died in a car accident when he was still a child. His father disappeared soon after. He left school early and began working young, first begging outside a restaurant, then repairing farming equipment. By his early 20s, he was training to become a qualified technician at the same repair shop he now worked. He was a heavy smoker. He had never been in a relationship. When police spoke to him, he told them he had never even tried speaking to women because he believed no one would want a disabled person like himself. They took this as evidence that he resented women. To the investigators under immense pressure, that background didn't read as vulnerable. It read as suspicious. So they interrogated him brutally for 3 days straight, and eventually he confessed to the murder. Not all of them, just the most recent one. According to records of that confession, he claimed that on the night of the murder, he had gone outside for some air. He then saw a light on in the house and felt a sudden urge. So he climbed inside the home and committed the crime. Afterwards, he claimed to have burnt his clothes, conveniently destroying all evidence. Police even claimed forensic analysis had confirmed a hair sample taken from the crime scene was a close match to Yoon, enough to state with some certainty that it belonged to him. A couple of months later in October, he was sentenced to life in prison. Even though he recanted his confession and claimed it had been coerced, the Supreme Court upheld the ruling in May of 1990 and the conviction stood. Police publicly presented the 8th case as solved. They didn't go as far as calling Yoon their serial killer, though. Instead, they proposed that he may have been a copycat, inspired by the other murders. They did, however, subtly suggest that he fit the profile of their killer and resembled the composite sketch. It was possible he was the monster that had been haunting the country for years. This idea was reinforced by the fact that after his arrest, the killings seemed to stop. But then on November 15, 1990, the body of 14-year-old Kim Mi-jung was discovered on a hill in the same general area as the previous victims. Once again, her own clothes had been used to bind her hands and feet, and her bra had been used as a gag. She had been assaulted and strangled, and her killer had even used a number of items she had on her during the assault, including a razor blade, a fork, and a ballpoint pen. Semen was recovered from the scene again, though nothing could really be done with it. Police once again believed the attacker had type B blood, and it seemed undeniable that it was committed by the same man responsible for the other murders. So this meant one of two things had to be true. Either Yoon Sung-yu had been wrongfully arrested and charged, or that the 8th murder was a copycat crime committed by him, and the true killer was still free. They opted for the second option, leaving Yoon trapped behind bars. In April of 1991, the final confirmed Hwaseong murder occurred. The victim was Kwon Soon-sang, an elderly woman in her late 60s. She was found in a wooded area on a mountain path. Her hands and feet had been bound. She had been gagged. She had been sexually assaulted, and she had been strangled to death with her own pantyhose. And then, abruptly, the murders stopped. No similar killings occurred in Hwaseong after April 1991. There were no more bodies found in rice fields, no more canal discoveries, no more late-night bus stop disappearances linked conclusively to the pattern. The terror that had defined Hwaseong for 5 years began to recede, not because the case was solved, but because it just seemed to have stopped. And when a serial offender stops, the investigation enters a different phase. Not active pursuit, but waiting. Waiting for a mistake, waiting for new evidence, waiting for a confession. But none came. By the mid-1990s, the Hwaseong serial killer case had become a national symbol of investigative failure. The scale of the investigation had been unprecedented. A phenomenal amount of time and resources had been put into it, and yet nothing had ever come of it. There was no suspect, no answers. In 2003, the film Memories of Murder, directed by Bong Joon-ho, was released, inspired by the case. It reintroduced the Hwaseong killings to a new generation, and the portrayal emphasized the investigative frustration, rural tension, and the psychological strain of pursuing an unseen predator. The film was incredibly successful in South Korea, and is often cited internationally as one of the best crime films of the 21st century. While Bong is now better known for his movie Parasite, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture, many cite Memories of Murder as his best work. Under South Korean law at the time, murder carried a statute of limitations of 15 years. This meant that because the final Hwaseong murder had occurred on April 3, 1991, on April 2, 2006, the statute expired. So even if the killer were ever to be identified, he could no longer be charged for the murders. This led to fierce public debate around whether statutes of limitations should apply to crimes like murder. And eventually, it led to the limit being extended to 20 years. But because this law did not apply retroactively, it meant nobody would ever be charged in the country's most notorious case. For the victims' families, the expiration felt like a second loss. For investigators who had worked the case, it marked the end of any official authority to pursue charges, even if new evidence emerged. However, unlike most cases where records and evidence were scrapped 1 year after the statute of limitations expired, authorities made a deliberate decision to retain all of the Hwaseong files permanently. Police continued to receive occasional tips. Detectives assigned to Hwaseong periodically reviewed the files. But officially, the case was done. Meanwhile, forensic science advanced, and DNA profiling became more sophisticated. In the 1980s, when the Hwaseong crimes were committed, South Korea did not yet have routine access to DNA profiling systems. Semen samples had been stored locally by police stations, rather than entered into centralized databases. By 2019, the National Forensic Service had developed far more advanced capabilities. In particular, they were now able to take even the oldest, most degraded DNA samples and accurately restore them to a usable profile. So on July 15, 2019, Gyeonggi Southern Provincial Police submitted preserved biological samples from the Hwaseong cases to the National Forensic Service to undergo this new form of testing. There was no guarantee it would work, and even if it did, there was no guarantee the profile would match anyone in their systems, and the crimes couldn't even be charged if they did. But still, the idea that the nation's open wound, its biggest unsolved murder case, could be solved was too tempting to just ignore. When the results came back from these new tests, they were extraordinary. DNA from 3 separate pieces of evidence connected to the 5th, 7th, and 9th cases came back as a definitive match to a single individual. A man who was not only already in the National Criminal Database, but was already behind bars, serving a life sentence in Busan prison for an entirely different murder. His name was Lee Chun-jae. Lee Chun-jae was born on January 31, 1963 in Hwaseong. He grew up in the exact area that would later become synonymous with terror. He knew the rice fields, the narrow irrigation canals, and the dirt paths well. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about him. He was the son of a farming family, and accounts from his neighbours described him as quiet, reserved, and not particularly social. He wasn't violent, he wasn't charismatic, he didn't stand out at all. But when Lee was still young, one of his younger siblings drowned. The death left a dark mark on the household, and family members later described him as becoming more withdrawn and isolated afterwards. One of his former classmates said that he became completely quiet, like a ghost. He attended local schools where he wasn't academically exceptional, or notably troubled in ways that drew any attention. Like many boys in rural Gyeonggi during the 70s, his future was expected to follow a familiar path: work, marriage, military service. In his early 20s, he completed his mandatory military service, being assigned to a tank unit. There, for the first time, he was part of a structured environment defined by a hierarchy and authority. Later psychological assessments would note that he appeared to derive a sense of control from structured power, from command, from obedience, from domination with rules. When he was discharged in January 1986, he was 23 years old, and that same year, the violence began. But even though the Hwaseong Murder series officially began that September with the killing of 71-year-old Lee Won-im, his criminal behaviour had actually begun months earlier. In February of 1986, he committed a sexual assault in the same region. The case didn't receive the sort of attention the murders would later attract. It was treated as an isolated crime, and no assailant was identified. But looking back, investigators would later see that certain elements were already present in the assault. He targeted a woman alone. He approached from behind. He acted quickly. He used the isolation of rural terrain to his advantage. The full ritual that would define the Hwaseong murders, the binding, the strangulation with clothing, had not yet solidified. but the core behavior was there. When the first murder occurred in September 1986, the geography was not random. The farmland around Anyongri and Jinanri was terrain he understood. The bus stops that connected factory workers to rural homes were predictable choke points. Women walked those paths alone at night because they had to. And Lee knew that. Because just as they'd believed at the time, he was living in the exact same small region where all of the murders were committed. Within weeks of Lee Won-im's murder, 25-year-old Park Hyun-suk was killed after stepping off a bus in Jinanri, then Kwon Jung-bon, then Lee Kai-suk, then Hong Jin-young, and with each murder, he perfected his methods. During the massive investigation, police questioned more than 20,000 men. Lee was among them. He was brought in and interviewed at least 3 times as part of routine screening within the 2-kilometer radius. But the investigation was increasingly guided by one central assumption: that the killer had type B blood. This was due to early crime scene forensics indicating blood found at the scenes was type B. Investigators took it as fact and filtered suspects out because of it. But Lee did not have type B blood. He had type O, and so he was never seriously looked at as a suspect. In fact, according to Lee himself, police actually asked him about other men and suspects in the area, more than himself. They took his blood sample, they recorded his details, and then they moved on. From his perspective, they had ruled him out entirely. He would later say he couldn't believe it, calling the investigators incompetent. And that realization only seemed to have emboldened him. As police deployed thousands of officers across Tayanup and the surrounding villages, Lee made no attempt to leave. He didn't relocate. He didn't alter his routine in any dramatic way. He continued living inside the tightening perimeter as a man who had effectively been cleared. He watched as patrols increased. He watched composite sketches circulate that bore a resemblance to him. As details that matched him were released, his height, his build, his soft hands. He watched rumors spread through the community, about women wearing red, about attacks happening only on rainy nights. And he adapted. When police presence intensified in one zone, he shifted to another. When media attention surged, he paused. When residents began walking in groups, he waited. By mid-1987, after the murder of Park Yun-ju in May, the killings appeared to stop altogether. Investigators believed their pressure tactics may have forced the killer into retreat. Some even wondered whether he'd left the region. But on December 24, 1987, during that supposed silence, 18-year-old Kim Mi-soon was murdered in nearby Suwon. The location sat outside the original Taean cluster and fell under a different jurisdiction, so it wasn't investigated by the same task force at the time. The method bore similarities: sexual assault, strangulation, but it was not formally consolidated into the case. Instead, Suwon police moved quickly to make an arrest and honed in on a 16-year-old boy as their prime suspect after he was arrested for stealing. During interrogation, they subjected him to severe torture, with methods including suspending his body upside down in the air. And under that pressure, he signed a confession. But within weeks, he collapsed and fell into a brain-dead state. And after more than a month in hospital, he died. The officers involved were later prosecuted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 1 to 6 years. But even then, the murder remained, on paper, a separate case. There was no public announcement that the Hwaseong killer had struck again, and so the belief that he had stopped continued. In September 1988, after Lee murdered 13-year-old Park Sang-hee in her own bedroom, public outrage intensified. And under immense pressure, police arrested Yoon Sung-yu in July of 1989. But while Yoon was still being questioned, on July 7th, a 7-year-old girl called Kim Hyun-jung disappeared in Taeanup. But she didn't vanish from a bus route, and no body was discovered. Because of that, the crime was never even looked at as part of the wider Hwaseong case. It was seen as a separate missing child case. One of the main factors the police ultimately used to explain the murder of Park Sang-hee as being a copycat crime alongside the location was her age. According to them, their serial killer had not specifically targeted anyone that young before. But that was only because they didn't realise that as they were literally coercing a confession out of Yoon, Lee had abducted and murdered a second child. With this new case seen as unrelated, Yoon was charged and convicted, and it actually did seem like the murders had stopped. But this wasn't because Yoon was actually the killer. It was because in September of 1989, Lee was arrested in Suwon after breaking into a home and remained in custody until April of 1990. A couple of months after he was released, he killed again in November before committing the final murder officially linked to the investigation in April of 1991. But these were not actually the only lives Lee had taken during this time period. On January 26, 1991, 17-year-old high school student Park Mi-hwa disappeared in Cheongju, in North Chungcheong province. The following day, her body was discovered inside a concrete pipe at a housing construction site. She'd been bound, gagged with her underwear, and strangled. Cheongju lay outside Gyeonggi province, beyond the jurisdiction of the original Hwaseong task force. At the time, there was no centralized system for linking violent crimes across provincial boundaries. And with one man already convicted in connection to the series, investigators were no longer looking for the same offender. In this case, another man was arrested, though he was ultimately acquitted due to lack of evidence. Regardless, the case remained isolated and unconnected, even though the method was disturbingly familiar. Then, 6 weeks later, it happened again. On March 7, 1991, 27-year-old housewife Kim Hong-bun was murdered in the same area, Cheongju. Her underwear had been stuffed into her mouth as a gag, and her hands were bound behind her back. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. She had also been stabbed in the left thigh. Just like the January case, it was handled locally and was not folded into the broader pattern at the time. So with the final linked murder in April, Lee had actually killed 14 women and girls. And after that, he seemed to stop. The end of the killings perfectly aligned with Lee getting married and having a son. Whether that was the reason or a coincidence is unclear. To neighbours and acquaintances, he appeared unremarkable. Married men were not supposed to be predators. He maintained employment. He lived within the community. He was respectful towards his father-in-law. But in private, Lee was the same monster he had always been. According to his wife, he was regularly violent towards her. He beat her over any perceived disrespect, locked her in her room for days on end, and frequently assaulted her. She even claimed he extended that violence to his young son as well. By December of 1993, Lee's wife couldn't take it anymore, and she left him. In response, Lee made multiple threats over the phone to her that he was planning something horrific, and that he would do things to her to ensure nobody else would ever want to marry her. A couple of weeks after she left, on January 13, 1994, Lee invited his wife's younger sister to his home in Cheongju, asking her to pick some things up. Once there, he gave her a glass of orange juice containing roughly 40 sleeping pills. When she lost consciousness, he sexually assaulted her and strangled her. Then he wrapped her in bin bags, tied her up with items of her own clothing, and disposed of her body. But this time, the crime did not go unsolved. Perhaps because for the first time, his victim had not been random, but someone deeply connected to him. The same day that he'd killed her, Lee actually went to his father-in-law's house, offering help in locating his missing daughter. He even accompanied him to the police station to report her as missing. But it wasn't long before police turned their attention towards him. After her body was discovered in the garage of a hardware store, Lee was brought in for questioning. According to the lead detective on the case, he immediately suspected Lee because every other member of the family was crying and grieving, while Lee showed no emotion or agitation at all. As he was questioned, Lee reportedly kept asking the detectives things like, "How many years would I get for rape and murder?" Inside Lee's home, they discovered his sister-in-law's blood under the washing machine in the bathroom and on the handle of the bathroom door. Just to point out, as I was curious myself, by 1994, Korean forensic labs were actually able to compare individual DNA samples due to new technological developments. But the samples from the previous murders were poor and degraded, and so even with these developments, they were essentially useless. At the time, anyway. Lee eventually confessed what he'd done, but by the time the case went to trial, he recanted his confession, claiming the police had tortured him and deprived him of sleep, forcing him to make a false confession. It didn't fly. And in 1995, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Later, as South Korea effectively moved away from executions, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. This specific case, somewhat ironically given everything, was recorded as the first case that police in the region had actually used DNA evidence to form a conviction. He was transferred to Busan prison, where his behavior was described as controlled and detached. He was a model prisoner. And for the next 25 years, that's where he remained, with nobody having any idea who he truly was. He never once mentioned anything about the Hwaseong murders to anybody. There was no attempt to link himself to his crimes for notoriety or fame. But in the end, he didn't have to. The evidence spoke for him. According to some accounts, when detectives arrived to confront him with their findings in 2019, his reaction was unnervingly calm. He didn't respond with shock or panic when they revealed they had confirmed him to be the Hwaseong murderer. Instead, they claimed he responded casually, saying something like, "So you finally confirmed it then?" Once the initial DNA matches pointed to Lee, the police moved fast. They began retesting additional items across the entire Hwaseong case set. By the time they sat down across from Lee, who was now 56 years old, they had scientifically tied him to 5 of the murders. They even got in contact with the only surviving witness, the bus driver, who was shown an image of Lee and confirmed that he was the man he had seen that night. There was no doubt at all that he was their serial killer. But even though his initial response made it seem like he was going to cooperate with them, he didn't. At least, not at first. Lee initially denied involvement, despite the evidence against him. But over the next 13 days, when the investigators returned again and again to speak to him, Lee slowly began to open up about his crimes. According to the investigators, the more evidence they showed him, the more something seemed to shift. Lee's posture changed. He stopped resisting the inevitable and began speaking freely. And when he spoke, he didn't just tell them details about the 10 Hwaseong murders they knew about. He admitted to the 4 additional murders that had never been linked to the case, and even over 30 additional sexual assaults. In every case, he described events with unnerving precision. He provided details about the crime scenes that had never been publicly released. He described how victims had been undressed. He explained the knots used in strangulation. He corrected minor inaccuracies in media reports. In some cases, he even drew sketches. DNA evidence had already linked him to 5 of the murders. For the remaining 9 he confessed to, police concluded that the credibility and specificity of his confessions were enough to prove he was responsible for them too. Perhaps most chilling was what didn't appear during the interviews. There was no dramatic breakdown, no visible anguish, no emotional collapse under the weight of what he'd done. When asked why he did it, Lee offered no grand explanation. He spoke instead of vague urges, of opportunity, and of the sense of control he felt in those moments. During the interviews, profilers attempted to assess his psychological state. As you can probably imagine, they concluded that he displayed strong psychopathic tendencies and showed no signs of genuine remorse or empathy towards his victims. Between September 2019 and April 2020, police conducted more than 50 interviews with Lee. By the time police formally announced their full findings in July of 2020, they stated that Lee Chun-jae had committed all 10 of the Hwaseong murders between 1986 and 1991, as well as 4 additional killings and at least 9 sexual assaults they had been able to confirm. For the first time in 33 years, the Hwaseong serial murders were not an open question. They had a name attached to them. But there was also another consequence of Lee's confession, and the police's conclusion that he was responsible for 14 murders. It meant that there was now no question that Lee had committed the 1988 murder of the young girl in Jinnan-ri. And in that instance, Yoon Sung-yu had already been convicted and imprisoned. Yoon had served approximately 20 years in prison before being released on parole in 2009. For years, the public narrative had treated him as a proven killer. He had lived under that label in a society where criminal stigma does not dissolve easily. But from the beginning, Yoon had claimed his confession was coerced. He said he'd been interrogated for days. He said he'd been deprived of food and water. He said he'd been beaten and that he'd been forced to sign a statement investigators had already shaped. But at the time, his claims were dismissed and his confession stood as the core evidence against him. So when it was declared that investigators were now 100% certain that Lee was responsible for all of the Hwaseong murders, including the crime Yoon had been imprisoned for, the legal system was forced to confront a painful reality, that Yoon had been telling the truth all along. In late 2019, almost as soon as the evidence against Lee was made public, Yoon filed for a retrial. What followed was not a symbolic hearing. It was a forensic re-examination of everything that had once been presented as certainty. Dozens of witnesses and experts testified in the hearing, including officers involved in the original conviction. Lee himself even testified and openly confessed to the crime in graphic and specific detail. He also admitted his guilt in the other 13 murders and even expressed shock that police had taken this long to identify him. The court concluded that Yoon's confession had been obtained illegally through violence and coercion while he was in a state of unlawful detention, and that it therefore had no evidentiary value. It also concluded that the forensic report used to connect Yoon to hairs at the crime scene had been falsified by investigators, describing it as fraudulently written. In December of 2020, the Suwon District Court declared Yoon not guilty. When the verdict was read aloud, applause broke out in the courtroom. The presiding judge issued an apology on behalf of the judiciary, acknowledging the immense physical and mental suffering Yoon had endured during his 20 years of imprisonment. The following year, Yoon and his family filed a civil lawsuit against the state for damages stemming from the wrongful conviction, and in 2022, the Seoul Central District Court ruled that the state had to compensate him approximately 1.8 billion won in additional compensation. This was on top of the roughly 2.5 billion won he had already received under the Criminal Compensation Act, which in total is around $3.5 million. The court also awarded separate damages to several of his family members. 7 police officers and a prosecutor were investigated for their criminal actions in Yoon's case, including abuse of power, violence, and fabricating evidence. But just like with Lee's crimes, the statute of limitations had run out on any crimes they had committed, and so none of them were ever charged with anything. In many ways, the retrial forced a painful realization. The Hwaseong case had not only been the story of a serial killer who had evaded capture for decades, it had also been the story of a system under immense pressure, a system that was so desperate for resolution that it was willing to bend the law and push uncomfortable boundaries. And this forced the nation to look deeper at how and why things had gone so wrong, not just in Yoon's situation, but in the entire case. By the time Lee Chun-jae's confession was verified and Yoon Sung-yu was cleared, the Hwaseong case had become something larger than a solved mystery. It became an audit, not just of one investigation, but of an entire era. The most significant failure, and the one that quietly shaped the direction of the case from the beginning, was forensic. Early crime scene testing had concluded that semen and blood recovered from multiple scenes belonged to a male with type B blood. That detail entered internal reports and gradually solidified into fact. Detectives began filtering suspects accordingly. Men were questioned, categorized, and in many cases dismissed based on blood type alone. Lee Chun-jae did not have type B blood, he had type O, and for years that discrepancy had shielded him. He had been questioned during the mass sweeps. His blood had been taken. His name had been logged. But because the working assumption was that the killer had type B blood, he was excluded from serious consideration. Exactly how the blood type conclusion was reached was never definitively clarified, but given the stored samples were type O blood, it's hard to comprehend how major the mistakes had to have been. It seems that the general belief is that samples tested at the time had either been contaminated, come from the victims themselves, or were somehow completely misinterpreted. Regardless, the conclusion ultimately protected the real offender and potentially led to many more lives being lost than could have been. And the blood type confusion wasn't even the only forensic mistake. The hair analysis, which claimed to have found trace metals, became another investigative focus. It led police to focus on suspects working in a welding or industrial trade. Again, this ruled the true killer out. Presumably, the hair studied was either using junk science to reach pointless conclusions, or it was just a random hair unrelated to the case that was analysed. The fact that at least 4 additional murders, all of which perfectly aligned with Lee's methods and signatures, were not connected to the case was also another major flaw. It seems like any crimes that didn't occur within the specific area the investigators believed the killer was operating were just completely ignored. Some of this, of course, came down to there being no databases or cross-jurisdiction communication at the time, but given how famous the case was, it seems difficult to imagine local investigators would not have seen the types of bindings and strangulation, and at least considered a link to the Hwaseong cases. One of the most shocking revelations that came out after Lee's confession was in respect to one of the newly linked crimes, the murder of 8-year-old Kim Hyun-jung in July of 1989. At the time, her case had been treated as a missing child report, and it was said that no body was ever recovered. So the case, which occurred while Yoon was being interrogated and accused of being the serial killer, was never connected. But after 2019, when new investigators began looking at the case to corroborate Lee's account of what happened, an entirely new scandal was unveiled. Because evidence surfaced suggesting that months after she vanished, items belonging to Kim, and potentially even her body, were discovered. Yet police did not inform her family, and the case was quietly closed. This led to 2 detectives being booked on suspicion of concealing a corpse and destroying evidence. But once again, the statute of limitations had expired, and no criminal charges could be filed against them. Court rulings later described the situation as organizational concealment. If Kim's case had been formally acknowledged as a homicide in 1989, it would have contradicted the claim that the killer had just been caught. It would have even undermined the justification that the 8th victim being a child could mean it was committed by a copycat killer. In an investigation already under extreme pressure, that contradiction may have been too damaging to accept, and so the truth was hidden. Another disturbing failure lay in the interrogation practices. As was seen in Yoon's interrogation, the police's desperation led to some shocking and appalling behaviour towards suspects. In December 1990, a 19-year-old confessed to one of the murders, but retracted his confession. It was later revealed that he had been electrocuted during the interrogation. Unlike Yoon, he was released, but he struggled afterwards, and later died of cancer at only 27. 4 more individuals who were brutally tortured and abused during interrogations in the case later took their own lives. The police publicly acknowledged the many failings in the case and issued an apology to the victims and their families. And as a result of all of these failures, the case reshaped South Korea's criminal justice system. Interrogations in serious cases became subject to mandatory recording. Forensic standards were revised. Investment in DNA analysis expanded dramatically. Cold case evidence retention protocols were strengthened, and the statute of limitations in murder cases was abolished completely. The case name was formally changed from the Hwaseong serial murder case to the Lee Chun-jae serial murder case. The renaming mattered. For decades, Hwaseong itself had carried the stigma of the crimes. The rural district had become shorthand for horror. Residents had asked for the name change, hoping to separate the community from the monster. Lee Chun-jae would not be tried for any of the murders. Under the law at the time, the statute of limitations had already expired. When his DNA was matched in 2019, when he confessed, when police stood before the nation and confirmed his responsibility, there was never a courtroom waiting for him. There would be no formal sentencing for the 14 women and girls he killed. No final verdict spoken over their names. The only punishment Lee would ever receive was the life sentence he was already serving for the 1994 murder of his sister-in-law. The Hwaseong killings would remain, in legal terms, unchargeable. Confirmed, documented and closed, but never prosecuted. For the families, that distinction mattered. Some had lived long enough to finally hear the truth. Others hadn't. And even for those who did, closure didn't arrive like a door shutting. It arrived like a file being stamped and placed back on a shelf. A name at last. An answer at last. But a kind of justice that could never fully match the scale of what had been taken. And yet, the truth did still change something. Because Hwaseong wasn't only the story of a man who killed and disappeared into the dark. It was the story of what the country's institutions looked like under pressure. What they did to suspects. What they overlooked. What they assumed. What they hid. And what it ultimately cost. Years after the murders ended, the roads in Hwaseong grew brighter. The county industrialized. The dirt paths became paved streets. The bus routes kept running. And the villages that once whispered about red clothing and rainy nights became ordinary neighborhoods again, at least on the surface. But the memory never really left. It lived in the way people locked their doors, in the way families escorted their daughters home, in the way a generation learned that evil didn't always arrive from outside the community. Sometimes it lived inside it and smiled back when questioned. On September 15, 1986, an elderly woman started walking home through the fields of Hwaseong. For decades, the question was, what happened to her? Now, the question is different. How close did they come? How much could have been prevented? And why did it take 33 years for the truth to finally catch up? The fields are quiet now. The roads are lit. And the monster has a name. But the cost of getting there was immeasurable. And even if the case is technically solved, I'm not sure anyone who lived through it will ever feel like it's truly over. And with that, our deep dive into this very complex case comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, comment, and hype, and all the other little rituals the algorithm gods demand of you. It all really does help give the video a boost. If you like what I do and want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube, and a Patreon linked down below as well. I can't offer you much for joining either of them. Hopefully when I finally get my act together, you'll be able to get my stuff early. But for now, you get to see your name at the end of my videos, alongside all the lovely folks popping up on screen in a few seconds. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.